to order the virtual high-level meeting on poverty eradication under the theme Trends, Options, and Strategies in Poverty Eradication Across the World. I would like to extend a warm welcome to you all. Before proceeding further, I would like to request participants to turn off their microphones when they are not speaking in order to ensure an orderly discussion. This meeting is available on live webcast and other platforms of the United Nations. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, I welcome you to today's event, which takes place at a time when the world is wrestling with an unprecedented public health challenge. I thank President Muhammad Buhari, President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, for his support to today's event. This event is significant as it marks the first in a series of policy dialogues or colloquia on poverty eradication, as well as the launch of the Alliance for Poverty Eradication. Alongside quality education and inclusion, the eradication of poverty is among the key priorities of the 74th session of the General Assembly, which I have the honor to lead. It's my hope that the aforementioned will strengthen the coordination of multilateral and multi-pronged interventions to eradicate poverty. Excellencies, poverty is clearly the most formidable obstacle to the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals and a blot on humanity's conscience. Poverty appears in different forms, notably as a lack of access to decent jobs, education, food, shelter, healthcare, potable water, sanitation, and deficiencies in many things that make life worth living. It has been identified as a major factor in expectant mothers' stress as the leading cause of pre- and postnatal complications. Conflict and strife will not last long if either's underlying trigger, poverty, is eliminated. Poverty joins conflict as the leading cause of migration. While poverty is bad and has been established as such, the COVID-19 pandemic has made a bad situation even worse. Before the onset of the pandemic, 2.1 billion people were classified as poor globally, with 767 million living in extreme poverty. It is estimated that by the year 2030, more than 100 million people would have relapsed into poverty due to COVID-19 and climate change. A study released by King's College London and the Australian National University in the first week of April 2020 paints an even grimmer picture that approximately 850 million people risked falling into poverty due to the sharp decline in economic activity. The ILO has highlighted the devastating impact of COVID-19 on employment, especially affecting youth and women. In 2019, the youth unemployment rate stood at 13.6%, a figure higher than for any other demographic group. In absolute numbers, approximately 267 million young people worldwide were either unemployed or were not receiving the education and training they needed to be employable. Youth aged 15 to 24 years were likely to be in low-paying jobs or to live precariously in the informal sector or as migrant workers. Connected to this problem is inequality. Inequality either trails or runs parallel with deepening poverty. Regrettably, inequality continues to widen while reinforcing social inclusion across the world. Counter to the aim of Agenda 2030, millions are being left behind as poverty deepens and inequality widens. Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, the plethora of resolutions relating to poverty passed by the General Assembly and the numerous programs of the United Nations targeting poverty is evidence of its determination to eradicate poverty. The foregoing is enough justification for the Alliance for Poverty Eradication. The Alliance can pull together all the factors and interests in poverty eradication and serve as a one-stop networking, information sharing, and bridge building center. The Alliance should provide a mechanism for interrogating the poverty challenge from all possible or at least multidisciplinary angles. There is no amount of time and attention given to poverty eradication that is too much. The Alliance for Poverty Eradication is like any other group of friends that champions various causes within the United Nations, be this in education, food security, affordable care, or climate action. It is indeed odd that while other causes that drive inspirations from the Sustainable Development Goals have groups promoting them, poverty eradication, the #1 Sustainable Development Goal, does not. I wish to state categorically that the Poverty Eradication Alliance selling point is that it provides a major opportunity to confront an enduring, complex, and multi-sided challenge. In this case, poverty. No wonder, as we were thinking of the alliance of today's high-level meeting, we had to bring in the International Labour Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Bank Group, UNDP, UNCTAD, Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, among others. The Alliance is expected to play an active role in the organization of colloquia on poverty eradication. It's no accident that the Alliance launch coincides with the first in the series of these policy dialogues. Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, I thank you all for your support for today's high-level meeting on poverty eradication strategies. I congratulate the founding members of the Alliance for Poverty Eradication and urge those who have not yet joined to do so. I'm grateful to the Charge d'Affaires ad interim of the Permanent Mission of Nigeria, Ambassador Samson Itogoji, who has agreed to serve as interim coordinator of the Alliance, pending when its members themselves make their own decision as to how to carry forward this important task for all of us. I'm sure you'll be hearing from him very soon. Excellencies, it's my pleasure to formally inaugurate the Alliance and declare the first in the series of colloquia on poverty eradication open. It's my pleasure and honor to now invite the Secretary General of the United Nations, His Excellency Antonio Guterres, to deliver an address. Mr. Secretary General.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished guests, dear colleagues. Let me begin by thanking the President of the General Assembly for organizing this high-level meeting. This event could not come at a more pressing moment. Now it's time to focus on the imperative to eradicate poverty in all its forms everywhere. The COVID-19 pandemic has laid bare the immense fragilities and challenges we face, from pervasive structural inequalities to inadequate health infrastructure to the lack of universal social protection. Societies, economies, and most of all people are paying a heavy price. And of course, the pandemic is placing even greater obstacles on the pathways to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Poverty eradication is central to the 2030 agenda, and has been a major focus of our concerted efforts. After many years of progress, poverty and hunger are today on the rise, reversing decades of progress and elevating already high levels of inequality within and between countries. And with so many aspects of this pandemic, the impacts are falling disproportionately on the most vulnerable, people living in poverty, the working poor, women and children, persons with disabilities, and other marginalized groups. Those toiling in the informal sector, often without access to any form of social protection, are particularly vulnerable to poverty in the looming economic recession. Excellencies, COVID-19 recovery and response must be focused on building back better. We simply cannot go back to the way things were. We have an opportunity to create a people-centered economic recovery with decent jobs for all, enabling people to work their way out of poverty. But this can only happen with the right policies in place, building on existing normative frameworks. We already have the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, and the wide range of international agreed development goals and frameworks to guide policy making. In addition, policies need to be informed by reliable and relevant analysis and evidence. Countries need to strengthen capacities for collecting and analyzing quality and reliable data. The first priority should be immediate support for at-risk workers, protecting and strengthening the resilience of micro, small and medium-sized enterprises, including women-led businesses, and expanding universal social protection coverage. I have called for a rescue and recovery package equivalent to more than 10% of the global economy. And greater international cooperation is urgently needed to support developing countries, including by providing liquidity and financial assistance, and by relieving or postponing payment of some foreign debts. We need to make the connection between health and healthcare needs and social, economic, and environmental well-being. Our interventions should also build on and bolster existing institutions while steering our economies towards inclusive and green growth for a better and strong recovery. We need to strengthen our multilateral system to help countries by extending solid policy advice, ensuring policy coherence, and settling international parameters for an employment-led and people-centered recovery. The challenges we face are enormously complex and interdependent. To effectively tackle them, I call on everyone, government, civil society, the private sector, and development partners, to accelerate global actions for a world without poverty. Let us firmly commit to the decade of action and deliver on the promise of the 2030 Agenda. Let us step up and strengthen solidarity and collaboration at this enormously challenging time. Thank you.
I thank the Secretary General of the United Nations for his statement. We will now be a recorded message from the President of the Economic and Social Council and Permanent Representative of Norway to the United Nations, Her Excellency Mona Juul. Please play the video.
Excellencies, colleagues, it is an honor to address this high-level meeting on poverty eradication and the formal inauguration of the Alliance for Poverty Eradication. All over the world, people are suffering as the pandemic continues to upend lives and livelihoods. The human cost and the economic consequences are staggering. With unemployment soaring, investments and remittances falling, the debt mounting, those with the least are, as always, hit the hardest. We may see an increase in global poverty for the first time in 30 years. Of solidarity, governments, businesses, multilateral organizations, and civil society have come together to combat this pandemic. Now we must attach the same level of urgency to the fight against poverty as we deepen our efforts in the decade of action and delivery for the Sustainable Development Goals. I pledge the full engagement of the Economic and Social Council. This charter body of the UN has poverty eradication at its core. ECOSOC has unique convening power, bringing together valuable constituencies such as youth and the private sector. The world must fight poverty by engaging women, men, and youth in solidarity and respect. We must put women at the heart of all development efforts, and poverty eradication is no exception. Excellencies, the alliance we are launching today can create a new momentum. Embodied in the very nature of the Sustainable Development Goals is a call for solidarity and collective action to shift the world onto a resilient development path and realize the human rights of all. Our recovery from the pandemic and the economic downturn will be quicker if we recommit to a spirit of cooperation guided by the Agenda 2030 and its recognition of poverty eradication as an indispensable requirement for sustainable development. Our world already has the knowledge, capacity, and innovation. Our call now is for enhanced political will and commitment. Thank you.
I thank the President of the Special Council of Statement. I now invite the coordinator of the Alliance for Eradication of the Poverty Eradication of Nigeria Inauguration to make a statement. Please.
Thank you so much, Mr. President of the General Assembly. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, let me start by commending the President of the General Assembly for demonstrating his commitment to leave no one behind by launching this initiative at the outset of this decade of action and delivery for sustainable development. We also thank you for saddling us with the responsibility of serving as interim co-chair of this alliance. Excellencies, being the topmost priority goal of the Agenda for Sustainable Development, eradicating poverty in all its forms and dimensions is important now more than ever. Perhaps, apart from the COVID-19 pandemic, no problem receives greater global attention today like poverty. In the developing world, poverty with its associated multiple deprivations appears to have the greatest effect on the economy amongst other contemporary socio-economic problems. The Copenhagen Declaration of 1995 was very succinct in shedding more light on what actually constitutes poverty in all its dimensions, when it is stated that poverty has various manifestations, including lack of income and productive resources sufficient to ensure sustainable livelihood, hunger, and malnutrition, ill health, limited or lack of access to education and other basic services, increased mobility and mortality from illness, homelessness, and inadequate housing, unsafe environment, social discriminations, and exclusion. It is also characterized by a lack of participation in decision and in civil, social, and cultural life. Fighting endemic poverty is not only about the right to human well-being, it is at the heart of the 2030 agenda. Given its cross-cutting nature, no country can truly lay claim to achieving sustainable development in its three dimensions as long as poverty persists. I wish to recall that in 2015, all UN member states made commitment inter-alia to end poverty and hunger everywhere, to combat inequalities within and among countries, to build peaceful, just, and inclusive societies, and to promote gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls by 2030. These aspirations can only be achieved if poverty, especially extreme poverty, is eradicated in all its forms and dimensions. Evidence indicates that poverty is the foundation of most social vices and crime, such as terrorism, illegal migration, conflicts, violent extremism, intolerance, fraudulent practices, exclusion, piracy, human trafficking, drug trafficking, and abuse and corrupt practices both in high and low places. The message from the foregoing is that poverty must be defined in both its manifest and consequential characteristics. It is against this background that my delegation wishes to stress that time is ripe for the international community to develop structures and strategies to address the scourge of poverty. The Alliance for Poverty Eradication must therefore offer hope and clearly point us to the right direction. particularly coming at a time when the dismantling of economic activities globally as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic is projected to revise gains already made in the achievement of the 2030 agenda, as well as push additional 500 million people into extreme poverty. Excellencies, conscious that extreme poverty is and has remained the backdrop for all deplorable social conditions and actions in all societies, the Alliance must pay keener attention to and to mobilize support for all sectors with potential to redistribute wealth and lift people out of extreme poverty. Having observed that micro, small, and medium enterprises offer hope to the most vulnerable in our societies, it is incumbent on the Alliance to galvanize the international community to further exploit the potentials of MSMEs, as well as those of ICT, agriculture, tourism, quality and technical education, access to energy, among others, to create jobs and empower the largest number of people in our various societies, including youths, women, and girls. It is also important for the Alliance to stimulate discussions and exchange of ideas on best poverty eradication policies and strategies for different member states and regions. Poverty in all its ramifications is multifaceted and deeply rooted. As such, an effective poverty eradication strategy must reflect its multidimensional nature, incorporating economic, social, cultural, and political dimension. Consequently, achieving the SDGs through poverty eradication will require the decisive commitment of all stakeholders involved, individuals, communities, governments, non-governmental organizations, and relevant international agencies. Excellencies, as we embark on this effort to achieve well-being for all, international solidarity and commitment will be key. I therefore solicit the active participation of all UN member states at all events of the Alliance, including its annual series of ministerial level policy dialogues or colloquium. Let me also express the hope that the reinvigorated resident coordinator system and other major stakeholders, such as key international financial institutions, private sectors, civil society, and the academia, will step up support and actively engage the Alliance in the realization of its noble objectives, particularly at the country level. Rest assured, Mr. President, that we will be more than committed to ensure that the Alliance shines light on the ease of poverty and sustain advocacy for the achievement of the goals and targets of SDG 1 for all countries, peoples, and segments of society. I thank you.
I thank the interim coordinator of the Alliance for Poverty Eradication for his statement. Will now be a recorded message from Mr. Oliver Deshita, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. Please play the video.
Good afternoon, and thank you for providing me with this opportunity to address the high-level meeting on poverty eradication. I'd like to commend President Mohamed Bande for his very timely and important initiative to propose the establishment of the Alliance for Poverty Eradication. To me, this is a very important initiative for three reasons. The first reason is that today the numbers of people in poverty in the world are still unacceptably high, and we are failing in our efforts to realize the first Sustainable Development Goal, which is to eradicate poverty. And this is not because poverty is some sort of natural disaster, a calamity imposed upon us. It is the result of policy choices that, if we understand them correctly, can be changed so that we win this fight against poverty. And to do this, there is no better way than to start from the situation of people in poverty and ask ourselves, moving up the chain of causes, why is it that these people are still poor? Well, the answer is we still have 55% of the world's population without access to any form of social protection. Only 29% of the population have access to the full range of social protection that they should be guaranteed. We still have 61% of the global workforce that is in the informal sector or in precarious forms of employment without access to social protection in many cases, and without a guarantee to be paid a minimum wage corresponding to what is required to achieve a decent standard of living. All this can be changed. And the first role of the Alliance for Poverty Eradication may be to understand better what must be changed by starting from the situation of people living in poverty to understand the policy choices that have affected them. A second role that this alliance may and perhaps should play is to improve global governance. I remember that in 2008-2009, immediately after the global food price crisis, we worked towards reforming the Committee on World Food Security in Rome. And this committee brings together all relevant UN agencies, civil society groups, governments, of course, and the private sector. And all these actors are now working towards a common understanding of the causes of hunger and malnutrition to ensure greater convergence in different policy areas towards eradicating hunger and malnutrition. Perhaps we need to do the same for poverty eradication. Perhaps we should ensure that in areas such as trade, investment, intellectual property rights, development cooperation, we work more closely together to ensure that all the policy choices we make in these different areas of global governance converge towards the realization of Sustainable Development Goal number 1. And this would mean ensuring that trade policies, policies in the areas of investment, intellectual property rights, and so on, are tested, assessed, in order to ensure that they contribute to the objective of poverty eradication. A third objective of the Alliance may be to support much better the efforts of developing countries to establish social protection floors so that these become universal, as was committed to when unanimously within the International Labour Organization, recommendation 202 on social protection floors was adopted in June 2012. Today, many developing countries face a financing gap, making it difficult for them to pay for a robust, rights-based social protection system. And that is particularly the case, of course, for the poorest countries, the least developed countries, who may deserve greater forms of support. And I note that in recommendation 202 on social protection floors, there was a reference to the need to establish an international solidarity mechanism to that effect. Now, together with others, we're working towards the Global Fund for Social Protection. And this Global Fund would have 3 functions. First, a coordinating function to ensure that the different efforts that are deployed in order to strengthen social protection in developing countries work more closely together. Secondly, a financing function to mobilize resources to match the efforts of developing countries to establish social protection floors by providing some financial support to help them overcome the financing gap. And thirdly, a reinsurance branch, a reinsurance facility, allowing countries that are poor with a poorly diversified economy to be much more resilient in the face of economic, climatic, pandemic shocks that may make it unaffordable for them to maintain rights-based, standing social protection systems. And these countries should be able to insure themselves against these shocks that may cause immediate liquidity problems, increase suddenly the public debt, make it more difficult for these countries to maintain the level of protection of the rights of the population that they have committed to, as we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic crisis. So these are my hopes for the Alliance for Poverty Eradication. I very much hope we can build this alliance to learn better what needs to be done, to converge better towards the eradication of poverty and ensure that all our efforts are dedicated to this end, and finally to close the financing gap that is still an obstacle for many countries to meet their obligations towards realizing the right to social security. I'd like to thank you again. I look forward to working with all of you in the future on these objectives. Thank you.
I thank the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, for his statement. As indicated in my letter dated 27 May, and letters sent later also in June on 25, 29, and 30, this high-level meeting consists of 4 segments: an opening segment, a high-level panel discussion, an interactive segment to share experiences and good practices, and a closing segment. The high-level panel discussion and interactive segment will be moderated by Ms. Melissa Fleming, Under-Secretary General for Global Communications. I'd like to invite the moderator and panelists to commence the high-level panel discussion. The opening segment is now concluded. I have the honor to invite Ms. Fleming to continue the discussion. Thank you very much indeed. Ms. Fleming.
Thank you, Your Excellency. The high-level panel discussion on trends, options, and strategies in poverty eradication across the globe is now called to order. Before proceeding further, I would like to remind all participants to turn off their microphones when they are not speaking so that we can have and ensure an orderly discussion. We will now view a video message from His Excellency Muhammadu Buhari, the President of Nigeria. Please play the video.
Your Excellency, Professor Tijani Bande, President of General Assembly, Your Excellencies, distinguished participants. At the outset, allow me to thank the President of the General Assembly for this laudable initiative. I also thank the Secretary General for his passion and commitment to the subject under review. Furthermore, my appreciation goes to the anchor members of the Alliance for Poverty Eradication for the commitment and the importance they attach to this cause. In these difficult times, it takes considerable boldness and courage to consider that which is in the interest of the greater good. The anchor members have done just that. The COVID-19 pandemic risks reversing decades of progress achieved in the effort to eradicate poverty. It is sad to note that more than 700 million people, or 10% of the world's population, are classified as living in extreme poverty. All the while, they struggle with the most basic needs like nutrition, shelter, health, education, and access to clean water and sanitation. In this condition, the number of poor people is estimated to triple as livelihoods across almost all economic sectors have been adversely affected. The current crisis have further shown how interconnected the world is, and thus the greater need for closer interaction and collaboration as we confront its impact. In Nigeria, with a population of about 200 million, over 54% of our people live in various stages of poverty, and the prospect of our population sliding further into extreme poverty is real. Excellencies, Nigeria attaches great importance to poverty eradication. It is for this reason that in May 2019, on my inauguration for a second term in office, our government committed itself to starting a new program of lifting 100 million Nigerians out of poverty within a 10-year period. In Nigeria, As in many other countries, the domestic supply chains and trading corridors have come under enormous strain. This has brought to fore the health versus economics debate, a subject that has captured the attention of global leaders and shaped the debate on how best to respond to the global pandemic while allowing citizens to earn their livelihoods. This debate is even more important for countries in sub-Saharan nations with large informal economies and a significant number of daily wage earners. The potential fallout makes this a national development priority. In line with the aspirations of the Sustainable Development Goals, we have equally integrated the economic, social, and environmental dimensions of the Sustainable Development Goals into our economic plans. In response to the challenges posed by COVID-19, the government has recently developed an economic sustainability plan aimed at stimulating the economy and extending protection to the very poor and other vulnerable groups through pro-poor spending. It is my conviction that devoting our efforts towards human capital development, efficient management of our resources, greater financial inclusion, and transformation of the agricultural sector to ensure food security are crucial to poverty eradication. In this regard, Nigeria continues to strengthen its existing social safety net initiative by increasing access to enrollees who fit the various programs in the scheme. Nigeria will also continue to provide easier and increased access to financial services for micro and small-scale businesses through the government enterprise and empowerment program. But we are determined to do more. Nigeria holds a view that education is a critical driver of sustainable development and has an immense capacity to eradicate poverty. Educating our children, especially the girl child, contributes significantly to the fight against poverty, environmental sustainability, and improved health, as well as building peace and resilient societies. I therefore welcome the launch of the Alliance for Poverty Eradication and endorse all multilateral actions aimed at eradicating the scourge of poverty and accelerating the realization of the Sustainable Development Goals. I thank you.
Thanks to His Excellency, the President of Nigeria. And next, we will view a message from Dr. Sania Nishtar, who is the Federal Minister and Special Assistant to the Prime Minister of Pakistan.
But now with the corresponding SDG, we are sadly moving backwards. Livelihoods have been decimated all over the world, and a whole new generation now risks living in the shadow of poverty unless we take urgent action now to dramatically increase social protection, which is why this initiative is so timely and important. In my own country, Pakistan, within 10 days of the lockdown, our government committed over $1 billion to deliver emergency cash to 16.5 million families, which given household size means reaching out to 120 million people. We drew on digital capabilities to deliver cash, combining national identity card numbers with data analytics, text messaging, and biometric verification. In 10 weeks, we have helped 11 million families, which represents the most extensive and the most transparent social protection operation ever undertaken in the history of the country and in the most difficult of circumstances. We are now planning for a massive scale-up of social protection through our new multi-sectoral framework called EHSAS, which means compassion in our language Urdu. Our experience with SARS has taught us that precision matters deeply in social protection, which is why we're using 21st century tools such as data analytics, precision payments, and data-driven accountability to help those in need. Mr. President, it may be too early to determine new poverty numbers, but we already know that COVID-19 has wreaked havoc with the lives of those that subsist on daily wages, those that earn piece rate, others that struggle with vending stalls in the informal economy, the tens of millions that have been laid off, and hundreds of millions of farmers who we think have subsistence living, but whose lives have been uprooted by the disruptions in local supply chains. The cost of COVID-19 is not limited to lives lost and morbidity. It is staggering in terms of hunger, children dropping out of school, and foregone health care. And as always, it is the women and girls that are disproportionately bearing the brunt of this tragedy. So it is a moral imperative for the international community to prioritize poverty alleviation and social protection, especially in view of a possible protracted crisis and its long-term consequences for vulnerable groups. The scale of action demanded from the world is unprecedented. Just to put things in perspective, there are 4 billion individuals without social protection in this world. The experience in Pakistan leads me to believe that it is possible to rise to the occasion. History shows us that disasters and their tragic consequences have a tendency to catalyze social change. So it may be cliched, but this crisis may well have a silver lining. We now have a one-in-a-generation chance to build a fairer world that ends poverty, inequality, and the climate crisis. I'm hoping the Alliance can play an important part in this transformation. I'm honored to be a part of it, and I want to thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, Federal Minister Nishtar. I would now like to invite the participants to view a video message from the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, Ms. Amina Mohammed. Please play the video.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, dear colleagues, I want to begin by extending my thanks to the President of the General Assembly, His Excellency Mr. Tijani Muhammad Bandi, for convening this high-level meeting, which marks the inauguration of the Alliance for Poverty Eradication. This colloquium series on poverty eradication is an important contribution to advancing the decade of action to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic, the pace of global poverty reduction was decelerating and the world was not on track to deliver Goal 1 by 2030. By 2019, more than 70% of the world population lived in countries where income inequality increased in the last 3 decades. 55% did not benefit from any form of social protection. Young workers continued living in extreme poverty, and poverty was persistently worsened by extreme natural disasters. The COVID-19 crisis has exacerbated poverty and structural inequalities. The most vulnerable, those in the informal sector, providing care or working in food production and supply chains, the service sector and delivery, are all laboring in precarious conditions and feel the economic hit. In some countries, people living in the poorest neighborhoods are dying at more than double the rate of more affluent neighborhoods. Recent World Bank estimates show that COVID-19 could push between 71 and 100 million people into extreme poverty in 2020. This can represent the first increase in global extreme poverty since 1998, effectively wiping out progress made since 2017. A large share of the new extreme poor will be concentrated in countries that are already struggling with high poverty rates and numbers of poor. Almost half the projected new poor will be in South Asia and more than a third in Africa, and hard-won development gains in LDCs are at risk of being derailed. Inequalities between social groups, including those based on age, gender, race, ethnicity, migrant status, and disability, are pervasive in developed and developing countries alike. The increase in the extreme poverty rate and number of extreme poor are projected to be significantly if inequality were to increase as a consequence of the crisis. The international community has announced support measures ranging from debt relief to strengthening social sectors and providing social safety nets for the most vulnerable. Maintaining this momentum while redoubling coordination efforts remains vital as the world moves towards recovery. We need to reset socioeconomic policies to build back better, investing in universal health care, education, social protection, equitable access to digital technology and connectivity, and support for micro and medium-sized enterprises. The United Nations is advancing emergency discussions on financing for sustainable development to ensure recovery efforts are aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. To recover better, we are advocating for enhancing external finance and remittances for inclusive growth, gender equality, and decent work. To provide fiscal space to countries to save lives and livelihoods, it will also be crucial to expand liquidity in the global economy, maintain financial stability, address debt vulnerabilities, create a space for private sector creditors to actively engage, and prevent illicit financial flows. We're also strengthening research and data by monitoring and analyzing global social and economic trends and emerging issues that have a bearing on poverty eradication, inequality, jobs, and social inclusion. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the policy response needs to build a bridge to recovery, ensuring social and environmental sustainability within the framework of the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs. Policymakers should not lose sight of the urgency of climate action, which provides an unprecedented opportunity to unlock massive economic and social benefits and accelerate structural transformations for sustainable development. A coherent, multidimensional approach is critical. Since the crisis has multiplied interconnected dimensions, a systemic approach, rather than a sector-by-sector sequential approach, will be essential. The United Nations has already presented a roadmap along these lines in its initial framework for immediate socioeconomic responses. The UN framework for the immediate socioeconomic response to COVID-19 is guiding our support on the ground. The UN development footprint spans 162 countries and territories, supported by a global and regional network of expertise. This means knowledge of context and established relationships. In many of these countries, the UN support is not restricted to the capital. It reaches local communities in cities and villages. And we are supporting member states with policy advice, technical support, and capacity development, and essential data and statistics to make informed decisions on development issues. We count on member states to play their vital part in securing a conducive environment to accelerate the achievement of all sustainable development goals. All of you are crucial in fighting poverty, our common enemy, and we need you more than ever. I wish you well and thank you for your commitment. Thank you.
I thank the Deputy Secretary General for her statement, and we will now continue with the discussion by hearing presentations by the distinguished panelists. Today, we are honored to have Mr. Guy Ryder, who is the Director General of the International Labour Organization, Mr. Chu Dong-kyu, who is the Director General of the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, Mr. Mukisa Kituyi, Secretary General of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, Ms. Alicia Barcelona Ibarra, who is the Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, Mr. Murad Waba, Associate Administrator of the United Nations Development Program, and Ms. Laura Jaitman, Special Representative of the World Bank Group to the United Nations and Head of the World Bank Group office in New York. Welcome to all the panelists, and I look forward to your presentations and must remind you that each one of your presentations must be limited to 5 minutes each. To start the discussion, I now give the floor to Guy Ryder, Director General of the International Labour Organization. The floor is yours, Mr. Ryder.
Well, thank you very much indeed for this opportunity to contribute to this very important panel and this subject of poverty eradication. I've been asked to put the spotlight on the situation of young people, and particularly young people in labour markets. And I think to begin, we have to understand that even before the current crisis struck, young people were very, very badly disadvantaged in global labour markets. they were 2 to 3 times more likely to be unemployed than other members of the labor force. That means that 68 million young people were unemployed in advance of the pandemic. But perhaps it's better to focus on this phenomenon of NEETs, those people who are neither in employment, education, or training. And if you look at the regional distribution of NEET populations, you come up with some extraordinary figures. 34% of young people in the Arab world are in this situation of NEETs. The figure for Asia and Pacific is 24%, Africa 20%, the Americas 19%, and Europe and Central Asia, the only region where progress is being made at 14.5%. A very painful conclusion to draw from all of this is that target 8.6 of the 2030 agenda, which calls for the substantial reduction of NEET rates, is more than unlikely to be met even before the pandemic hit. Just to give you a couple of other figures, 3 out of 4 young people who were in jobs were working informally with a lack of social protection and the precarious conditions that that implies. As a result of all of this, 126 million young people in work were still living in poverty. So we clearly have to get young people not only into jobs, but into decent jobs as well. And from that very discouraging baseline, the pandemic hit. What has a pandemic done to the situation of young people? Well, firstly, it's led to a lot of young people simply being shaken out of work. 1 in every 6 persons below the age of 28 who was working at the beginning of the pandemic is no longer working. They've been shaken out very quickly. Education and training has been massively interrupted. Those young people who are leaving education and going into the labor market, always a hazardous transition, are likely now to find absolutely impossible conditions for their entry into decent work, their access to decent work. Our surveys show that very high proportions of young people are now subject to mental health stresses, depression, very strong negativity about their own prospects for acceding to the world of work. What can we do about all of this? Well, today the ILO published its latest estimates of the job destructive effects of the pandemic. There's a startling figure that we need to linger. This is on the 400 million full-time job equivalents lost in the first 6 months of this year and the incomplete recovery process that's likely to follow. Last August, and it was an encouraging experience, the ILO organized in Abuja in Nigeria a global youth employment forum, which set an agenda for youth employment for the future, very strongly aligned to the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. We need to take those conclusions of that forum seriously. We need to build them into the 4 pillars of policy action with which we need to mitigate the social and economic consequences of the current pandemic. That means stimulus activity. That means using all of the fiscal and monetary tools at our disposal, supporting enterprises, particularly small enterprises, retaining jobs and supporting incomes. We need to protect workers. We need to engage in dialogue. These are the instruments in our hands. They need to be used, and they need to be applied particularly to improve the situation of young people who, in their absence, are likely to constitute what we have called a new lockdown generation, primary victims of the current pandemic. It doesn't have to happen. We should not let it happen. And if we act effectively to ameliorate their position, then I think we will be working in a very effective way to advance the objectives which we are setting for this very important alliance for poverty eradication, to which the ILO wholeheartedly subscribes and wishes to support. I'll leave it at that. Thank you, moderator, for your attention.
I thank Mr. Ryder for his sobering remarks and alert to all of us on the situation for young people, particularly in the COVID-19 period. Now I would like to invite Mr. Chu Dong-kyu, the Director General of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, to speak to us.
Thank you, Melissa. Dear colleagues, entering into the decade of action to achieve the 2030 agenda, we found ourselves facing multiple challenges. 740 million people still living in less than $1.19 a day. And the measure to contain the virus has pushed the world into a deep recession. The World Bank predicted that the global economy will contract by 5.2% this year, push about 100 million people into extreme poverty. Conflict and extreme climate conditions continue to pose a threat. All this undermines decades of progress on poverty reduction. To protect and keep up progress achieved, we need new champions to lead the efforts towards achieving SDG 1. That's a direct linkage to the SDG 2. And also we needed to keep rural development, agriculture, and the food system at the front line of national development agenda. After all, 80% of extremely poor live in the rural areas. Rural development offers the most direct route for rural population to benefit from their assets, land, and labor. Reducing rural poverty requires increased productivity of small-scale production, agriculture, diversified economic activities, and investing in human capital. And agriculture is the backbone of the economy in many developing nations. Evidence shows that investing in agriculture has a greater impact on long-term poverty reduction than investment in other sectors, especially the whole chain of agriculture, from the production to processing. And the food value chain it also is a labor-intensive industry. That's especially so in the low-income countries. So agriculture is crucial for ensure food security as well as ending extreme poverty. Promoting specific crops value chains can have a big impact on poverty reduction and also generate nutritional benefits. For example, smallholder farmers. So it provides them more access to the market, credit, and connectivity, enhance their productivity. The role of agriculture is even more relevant now. The pandemic has hit the rural area hard. Restriction on movement, disrupted agricultural production, and food supply chain. So this picture is so clear. And especially season works, lost wage, and harvest production eroded in the field. 1/3 of job of the livelihood in our food system can be wiped out. Pandemic has led to bare deep inequality in our society, as mentioned by several times by the SG and other colleagues. So finally, rural institutions needed to be strengthened. And ladies and gentlemen, the food system-based multiple sector approach I described so far is at the heart of the hand-in-hand initiative I came to the office last August. Launched in 2019, it's a country-owned, country-led effort based on the strong partnerships to improve the agricultural potential of countries, therefore reducing poverty, eliminating hunger. Therefore, work with countries by investing in innovative and inclusive value chain building human capital. Together, our efforts to achieve SDG 1, and we also launched the Rural Extreme Poverty Framework last year. And last time ago, some colleagues asked also, we recently launched the food collective in rural to face the preventing the food crisis. And newly established the FAO Office for Small Island Development State, listed development standalone development state, which also fully engage to have the most vulnerable to be sure that no territory is left behind. Another recent creative office, the Office of Innovation, ensure that the adoption of technology work for the rural poor. It will also lead the preparation of the secretarial report on eradicating rural poverty in collaboration with the UN, DESA, and other UN agencies. This is the recognition of a key role in addressing rural poverty. And also, we are going to have a proposal to the next council next week for the new office for SDGs. So that's the first thing in UN system. We have a special office for promotion, look at the SDGs for next 9 years or 10 years more. We are deeply committed to supporting education of extreme poverty, our technical knowledge, and also our 75 years of expertise. And also we will strengthen the investor centers and the others first done already to strengthen South China cooperation with the national government, our partners, and the civil society towards this important goal. Let's join hands the world free of poverty and hunger. Thank you. And let's work together, study together, contribute together to end the eradicate hunger. That's the most, the basic human rights we should do. Thank you all to you.
Thank you.
Alisa.
Thank you, Mr. Chu, for that also very powerful message at the end and reminding us how important rural poverty is this, not just in this time, but before, and your measures and all FAO's work in working to alleviate poverty in rural areas. It's my pleasure now to invite Mr. Mukisa Kituyi, the Secretary General of the UN Conference on Trade and Development, to deliver his presentation.
Thank you very much. Excellencies, the sustained poverty reduction observed over the last 30 years was driven by an export-driven growth model that has now almost come unstuck in the COVID era. It has left policymakers, developing countries, pressing to understand new pathways to durable poverty reduction and development problems. The global health emergency represents not merely a bump along the road to continued poverty reduction, but rather signals an inflection point in the transformation of international production, which policymakers must now pay attention to so that to make poverty eradication a reality by 2030 or even beyond. Addressing the division of the world into pockets of poverty and plenty has been the aim of many of our goals and organizations. But with borders closing, supply chains shortening, economic nationalism on the rise, policy options are now more constrained, meriting out-of-the-box reflection on the changing opportunities afforded by this new landscape. First, it's important to realize the limits of the progress that has been registered on average during the last 30 years, as extreme poverty was more than cut in half globally. That progress was largely an Asian-led story. It was not distributed evenly, and progress towards higher living standards was stalled in very many parts of the developing world. For example, even before COVID, the number of people living in extreme poverty had risen in several sub-Saharan African countries and in parts of Latin America and the Caribbean and Western Asia. Taking account of demographic development, economic performance of African countries, and many of them LDCs, will determine much of the success of the 2030 Agenda's poverty eradication goals. It is therefore particularly worrying that even before COVID struck, the persistent output losses and setbacks in poverty reduction strategies that followed the commodity price downturn of 2014-2016 had already caused many African economies to experience a decade of near stagnation in per capita terms. At the global level, average real incomes in 2019 were lower than in 2014 in 1/3 of commodity-dependent countries, home to about 870 million people. And now, with the COVID-19 ravaging the developing world's economic prospects, even before its full health impacts have been felt, a major setback in global poverty reduction is taking shape. As many as 140 million additional people fall into poverty in 2020. Africa will continue to to account for more than half of this number globally. But with the COVID crisis only accelerating the realignment of global production towards shorter, more regional, more intangible, and less low skills driven labor intensive value chains, developing countries now face greater obstacles for achieving higher growth and concomitant poverty reduction success. The onus of poverty reduction will now rest on the backs of African and LDCs and will require broader strategies to economically empower the poorest and most destitute. There will be no magic bullet for meeting the new post-COVID poverty challenge. It will take holistic efforts in each country and stronger cooperation and solidarity by international partners. We at UNCTAD see these efforts as necessary in focusing development of productive capacity and transforming production and export structure as the only sustainable and long-term solution to eradicating poverty. Developing productive capacities involves capital accumulation, structural change, technological progress. It requires enhancing productivity and international competitiveness of domestic firms and enhancing their survival rates. But in Africa and LDCs, most workers are in low productivity and low wage jobs in areas that cannot boost this productive capacity. There is therefore urgent need to transform the structure of these economies, reallocating resources from low to high productivity activities and going further into higher value services. We are glad that we are building as a collective exercise development productive capacity index that will be shared in the development community within the UN and other multilateral agencies. Our index looks at 8 core drivers, which we'll hope will be useful as we continue to build this conversation and deal with the unique circumstances that we have had to confront, partly because of pre-existing conditions exacerbated by COVID, and partly because of uncertainties that have been thrown in by this pandemic. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kutuyi. That was also very enlightening, the focus on the development of productive capacity going forward. So thank you for that, that very interesting statement. And now it is my pleasure to give the floor to Ms. Alicia Barcena, who is the Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. Alicia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Melissa. And I would like to thank you and your excellencies. I have to say that in Latin America and the Caribbean, the challenges associated with poverty eradication are structural, multidimensional, and persistent. The region is the most unequal in the world in terms of distribution of income, with an average Gini of 0.46 in 2019. But it's also unequal on wealth. The Gini is 0.8. And poverty and inequality has a woman's face. It is also beset by racial, ethnic, and territorial inequalities in the different stages of the life cycle, which means that many populations are being left behind. Culture of privilege that favors the elites is historical. More than half of the workers, 54%, are in the informal sector, and mostly are women. Unfortunately, our region now is the epicenter of COVID-19, with dramatic impacts on health, economic, and social terms. And it will result in a big setback in terms of poverty eradication and achieving goal 1 of the SDGs. Our region, though, I have to admit, made significant progress between 2002 and 2014. We publish, as every year we do, the social panorama with poverty data for more than 30 years. So we found that poverty decreased from 45% of the total population to 27.8%. That means we got out of poverty 66 million people. However, and extreme poverty as well, from 12 to 7%. And this was driven by job creation and formalization of jobs. And also because there was political leadership. We call it the progressive decade, in which eradication of poverty, inequality, and social inclusion and universal protections were priorities in the public agendas. But the region, in that decade, the region increased the number and reach of non-contributory social protection programs and successful conditional and non-conditional cash transfer programs, and labor inclusion programs, and social pensions that are not so costly. It's really around 0.7% of GDP. All these programs boosted incomes to the households, but also redistribution. But they brought another very important thing, and that is dignity. Dignity, particularly to the elders. Also, progress on Goal 4 was notable. Almost complete universalization of primary education and greater enrollment in secondary education, adoption of technical and professional education for segments traditionally excluded. Now, the significant gains were linked to three main factors: income growth, and which an income related to labor makes up to 72% of the household income, but also public transfers under social protection systems with expanded entitlements. And the other thing is remittances, which represent a key element of income in the region. However, since 2014, with a persistent economic slowdown, we went down for 7 years. And if we don't do something quickly in 2020, we are at the risk of another lost decade and a reversion of 13 years. We ended up 2019 with 185 million people and 65 million in extreme poverty. So based on what's happening with COVID-19, we are very worried because we calculate that poverty will increase 30 million people more, reaching to 215 million, and extreme poverty by 16 million, affecting 83.4 million people. 83.4 million people that are also at risk of hunger. So that is something that worries us, that the sanitary crisis might become a hunger crisis. Now, we are suggesting, and that's why we are proposing very concrete actions. Number one, a basic emergency income to all of those in situation of poverty, equivalent to one line of poverty, $140 approximately for 6 months. We estimate this could cost 2.1% of GDP. And this could become the basis for a universal basic income that could be implemented gradually. Secondly, a hunger coupon or bond equivalent to 70% of the extreme line of poverty, which is approximately $50 per month for 6 months, with a cost of 0.45 of GDP. And of course, a support to the small and medium-sized companies with subsidies. No point in giving them credits. They're going to be they're going to be in very bad shape next year. And of course, a commitment to rescue strategic enterprises, but they have to maintain jobs. And expand liquidity and financial access to the middle-income countries of our region. We need to focus also in building back better, Melissa, and this is what the SG has been telling us and the DSG, to redirect investments and idle capacity to enhance productive inclusion with more technology, by the way, with digital technology. We have to make it universal for everybody and universal access to welfare. But also, and finally, we need better institutions which can be achieved, tackling corruption, increasing trust in public institutions. A social compact for equality is imperative in our region with a fiscal and financial international compact. Building back better for our region means building back better with equality. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Alicia. It's extremely worrying, the numbers that you just outlined for us, but also very inspiring, your blueprint for how to emerge, not just protecting people who are falling into poverty, but building back better. Thank you very much. I would now like to invite Mr. Morad Wapa, Associate Administrator of the United Nations Development Program. The floor is yours, Mr. Wapa.
Thank you very much, Chair, and Mr. President, distinguished delegates. I'd like to start off, if I may, with the observation of the Secretary General that poverty goes far beyond income measurement. It is a multidimensional phenomenon, and indeed has been shown to be a multidimensional phenomenon by the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, where the socioeconomic impact of that pandemic hit most countries well before the health impact of the pandemic was realized. Based on available evidence, we've been working on a multidimensional poverty analysis with the University of Oxford. And while we have sort of even perhaps starker figures of 1.3 billion people in multidimensional poverty, an interesting observation is that 2/3 of the people in multidimensional poverty are in middle income countries. And as perhaps I think Alicia was referring earlier. A second broad observation is that in measuring the impact of COVID on human development, which has been long a UNDP field of specialization, we find that for the first time since 1990, since we've actually been having measurement of human development, we've seen a reversal of human development. We believe that this year, the progress of the past 6 years probably will have been eliminated. So these are very stark figures. With that, what we thought we would be doing is, together with our colleagues at the United Nations, in the United Nations country teams in countries, under the guidance of the resident coordinator, we would look at a more specific assessment of what's been going on in the world. And we have to date a socioeconomic analysis of the impact of COVID on 68 countries, more coming on stream, and 5 regions, working very closely, I have to say, with the regional economic and social commissions. These analyses, I think, are very broad and point to this multifarious impact of COVID on poverty, but I think 5 broad conclusions can be derived. The first is that country context matters. The pandemic's economic impact is expected to be felt differently across countries, depending on their underlying economic, governance, and demographic structures. Most countries, and indeed most governments, are faced with the grim trade-off between supporting livelihoods and saving lives. Trends and patterns emerging from countries' socioeconomic impact assessments show severe shrinkage of fiscal space, likely to affect the needed investments in social policies and programs, very much along the line, again, of Alicia's statement. A second broad statement is that the socioeconomic assessment of country performance have been instrumental in identifying blind spots. I think there was reference earlier, again by the Secretary General, to data scarcity. And I think that one of the main conclusions that we will have to derive from there is to focus on disaggregated data and indeed real-time data. Our ability to protect the most vulnerable relates to the ability to identify them. Further, we see an increase in gender-based violence as exposing the urgency to address the deeper and the intersectional drivers of gender discrimination. A third broad observation is that what we have seen in many countries, not all, but in many countries, is that the social contract between the state and population is being eroded. We see systematically weak judiciary systems, limiting the protection of human rights and access to justice for many. We see the potential politicization of government response and the spread of fake news, specifically on this issue. Weak and uneven trust in government could further undermine the social contract. Fourth, we see a very strong case, and there I would also rejoin Alicia, in a strong business case for investment in a green economy. Recovery is not recovery to the status quo ante, but certainly recovery better towards a better future. I know France has been making great strides in this respect. We need to de-risk nature-based solutions as part of the social safety net for the world. For instance, our analysis in national stimulus packages in Asia and the Pacific countries show that investments in green recovery will have beneficial effects for the whole of society. And fifth and last, investments in innovation and digital transformation are required. Closing the internet access gap in low and middle income countries is estimated to cost about $100 billion, or about 1% of the world's COVID-19 fiscal programs to date. The upcoming report of the Secretary General's Task Force on Digital Financing of the SDGs will provide further information, but I believe as of now, we understand the impact of closing the gap of internet access in schooling and indeed in productive work. Perhaps I'll stop there, if I may, Melissa, but once again, really to pledge UNDP's full support in this common work on the Alliance for Poverty Eradication. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Murat, and also for your building back better and greener messages that I think gives us all some hope. It's my pleasure now to give the floor to Ms. Laura Jademan, the Special Representative of the World Bank Group to the United Nations and the head of the World Bank Group in New York. The floor is yours, Ms. Jademan.
Thank you very much, Ms. Fleming. Good morning, Mr. President of the General Assembly, Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor for me to be today representing the World Bank Group at this timely event. As you know, ending extreme poverty and achieving shared prosperity is the core of the World Bank Group mission. So we welcome today's discussion and the PGA's launch of the Alliance for Poverty Eradication. As I was asked, I will focus on financing for development. I'll focus first on this evolution of poverty pre and post COVID-19 and the impacts on developing financing. Then I'll talk on the bank's response, including partnerships, and then I will focus a bit on the recovery. Many already mentioned that in the last quarter century, there was a reduction of extreme poverty, a decrease from 36% of the world's population living in extreme poverty in 1990 to 10% in 2015. In the recent years, we saw a slowdown in this decrease of extreme poverty. And to reach SDG 1 and to further reduce poverty, we would require much higher than historic growth rates in the poorest parts of the world. However, against this backdrop, COVID-19 hit with severe consequences on growth and poverty, as many of the colleagues mentioned before. Many pointed to the recent work by the World Bank released, the Global Economic Prospects Report, which shows a 5.2% contraction in 2020 of the global economy. Just to complement what others said, to put this in context, this is the deepest recession since Second World War. Despite all this unprecedented public support, stimulus, coordinated actions by advanced economies, and also contrary to recoveries from the past that we saw after the 4 past global recessions, this will be a slower recovery. 5.2% contraction is around $4.2 trillion drop in global GDP this year. To have an idea of the order of magnitude, it's like roughly the combined size of Germany and Belgium together, or larger than the entire of South Asia economy. So of course, this will hardly hit on poverty and the poverty reduction efforts. As DLC Amina Mohammed pointed, the bank estimates that 71 million to 100 million more people will be pushed into extreme poverty this year. This will have severe implications for financing. We know that already the financing gaps were very large, and now the situation is even worse. And while most upper middle income countries can expect to see their access to capital markets progressively restored, but at potentially higher spreads, prospects for low middle income countries and low income countries are likely to remain uncertain for a longer period. If we think about the typical sources of funding for countries, we have on the domestic side, tax revenues, private savings, on the foreign side, public inflows like official development assistance, ODAs, debt, or other official flows, and private inflows, FDI, remittances. All of these typical sources of financing have been negatively affected by the pandemic and the lockdown measures enacted. On the domestic finance side, we have tax revenues that have declined given the drop in production, consumption. On the foreign finance side, the impact on finance includes unprecedented capital outflows, leading to currency depreciations and widening of credit spreads in many countries. We also foresee a 35% decrease in foreign direct investment flows to low and middle income countries due to COVID-19. And if we talk about remittances, this is a very important source of funding for many of our member countries. We foresee a decrease of 20% this year, which is unprecedented in historical terms. What does it mean? That for us, the international community, we should work coordinated together to assist countries to meet their financing needs and to help them create fiscal space to respond to this emergency and for the recovery. On the bank's response, I want to highlight that the bank is providing fast, flexible, and comprehensive response to the pandemic. The bank is aiming to deliver $160 billion by June 2021. This is unprecedented. Our offices are working around the world, around the clock. And today we have already reached 100 countries, representing over 70% of the global population. This includes programs to reinforce health systems, protect the poorest households, aim to save jobs, businesses, get money to people who need it most, particularly in low-income countries and in fragile and conflict-affected states. IFC, our private arm, is also private sector, is also providing financing to private sectors, to SMEs. MIGA, our investment guarantee agency, is also helping to provide a more stable environment for investment and mitigating risk. And the World Bank and the IMF, as you know, support the G20 Debt Service Suspension Initiative, the DSSI, for eligible low-income countries. President of the World Bank Malpass, together with IMF MD Kristalina Georgieva, were the first to call for this initiative and strongly support the first steps taken so far. As of now, I'll give you an update. From the 77 eligible countries, 41 already requested to participate in this initiative, and more are considering to join. And the bank thinks that this much-needed further relief can be provided by private sector participation on this initiative on comparative terms. On the calls for MDBs to join this initiative, let me tell you that the bank has been working together with the other multilateral development banks, other 9, and we all together, following a very thorough risk analysis and keeping in mind we finance our activity through raising funds on international capital markets, we jointly come to the consideration that participating in this initiative, the DSSI, is likely not in the interest of our clients. Rather, the best way to support the initiative and low-income eligible countries by the MDBs is focusing on providing large net positive flows towards poorest countries and on highly concessional and grant terms. Finally, the IMF and the World Bank are working together on debt transparency and on the implementation of this and monitoring of this initiative so that the resources that countries can save go to critical investments. To conclude, let me highlight partnerships. Partnerships are key to respond to the pandemic and the recovery beyond. The World Bank, with a number of UN agencies, has been working together in the last months, for example, with UN partners on complementing procurement efforts, including with the World Food Programme, on vaccines, with CEPI, WHO, TFATM, and Gavi on education. We are coordinating with UNICEF, UNESCO on school reopening policy frameworks and on distance learning. On social protection, the vanishing efforts with ILO, UNDP, just to mention a few. So to conclude, Let me reiterate that the bank is looking forward to continue working together with UN and other international partners to assist our member countries to meet the dual challenges they now confront. First, addressing, of course, the immediate threat to people's lives, as well as social and economic impact of COVID-19 crisis. And second, staying on course to achieve their long-term development objectives as embodied in the mandate of our institutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Jademan. We appreciate, obviously, so much what the World Bank is doing around the world and how you've stepped up in this crisis. I think what you've all said is that we are in a time, I think Guy Ryder said that we could face a lockdown generation of young people. Alicia said that she's in a region that has the most inequality in the world, and that although there was tremendous progress over a decade, we could risk going into a lost decade. So I think all of you have outlined concerns about backtracking on poverty gains and in fact new levels of poverty and even extreme poverty, unlike any that we've seen for a long time, including our colleague from FAO, and also Alicia mentioned a very big concern about hunger. So I'd like to just, all of you have mentioned quite a bit about what you've done. We only have a very little time for a question. And so I would like to ask Alicia, because you were very specific about what you recommend. And it sounds like kind of such a simple formula, a basic emergency income, as well as a hunger coupon that would not cost governments very much. I'd just like to ask you how is this resonating? Has this gotten any takers?
Thank you so much, Melissa. Indeed, it has. I have to say that many governments in the region are taking on this basic emergency income. They are calling it in different names, but definitely has taken a lot of traction. Now, the thing is that we are suggesting to expand it for 6 months. Some governments have done it for 2 or 3 months, but we believe this crisis is going to last longer. On the coupon, on the hunger coupon, this is a proposal we did together with FAO, and it has taken a lot of traction. We have been in touch with ministers of agriculture to revise this proposal and see how best they can implement it. There are countries where monetary coupons are feasible because they have a register of the people, others that have to give it in kind. So this is getting a lot of traction. And I have to say, Melissa, that next Thursday, we are going to launch a report on which are the productive sectors more affected and what kind of help can be given to the small and medium-sized enterprises, particularly those hardly hit from services. So over to you. We hope to have these figures this week.
That's very encouraging, Alicia. Thank you. That's going to keep us going for a while. I have a question to Murad Waba. You said that you are seeing signs, and I think I heard the message from all of the panelists that we are all trying to deliver this message that going back to where we were is not where we want to go. That wasn't normal. That wasn't a good normal. We want a new normal. We want to recover better. And you said that there is a strong business case for a green recovery. Can you make that case to us here?
Not directly in numbers, if you like, because they vary from country to country. But what we are seeing certainly is 2 elements. First, a movement away in power generation from coal and from the heavier sort of hydrocarbons and towards renewable resources. And I think President Macron said that this morning. The second broad element, I think, is increasing reliance on distance learning, on internet-based solutions, which in and of themselves will reduce, say, transport needs and transport costs. So we believe that we've seen both in terms of power generation and in terms of increased use of the internet in the world of work, specifically a movement away from carbon-based solutions. A second broad array of solutions we've seen in our analysis of different countries is a focus on nature-based solutions, and specifically on a better management of, or better prevention, if you like, of zoonotic diseases. So again, nature-based solutions, both in power generations, but also in the production of food.
Excellent, thank you so much. And that also gives us a bit of hope. Mr. Chu, I'd like to ask you a question because hunger did come up as one of the most worrying and disturbing impacts, fallouts from the COVID-19 crisis. Is there anything, because people are really aware of this looming problem, is there anything that gives you hope that we can make sure that not more people go hungry, and that we could actually build back better in that area as well?
Thank you, Melissa. And I think I'm a very optimistic. We have to say goodbye to the past, but at the same time, we can't to go back to the past. So any challenge, in Chinese, it's a crisis is two sides of a coin. So it's a crisis, it's a challenge, and sometimes it's a new opportunity. For the agricultural food, first, I think digital agriculture and food, digital governance, digital society of rural area development. Second, we have to more accessible to the new technology and the new e-commerce to have the agricultural food produce more and better. Better means a better production, better nutrition, better environment, and a better life for the farmers and in the vulnerable area. So third, we need more investment. And that's why we're hand-in-hand initiative. We want to get all the key players on the board, private sector, civil society, international financial institutions. I'm so glad that the World Bank and others to really on the board, to have the anticipatory action to humanitarian aid. We need the emergency call, but also we need for agricultural rural development, we need a long-term and mid-term development for get the poverty eradicated. That's a case experience in China, in other countries, and also in some areas in Africa, in East Europe also. We think we can build back and better, and also we can produce more and better. That's essential. And so with that strong political willingness and commitment and strong investment and more on the agricultural food chain, not only production, then we can have a chance to reduce the hunger and back to the track. That's what I hope. We need all the collective action. Yeah, thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much. And I think we'll all take that message to be opportunistic with us as we carry out our mandates and our work to build back better and to overcome this crisis. So I'd really like to express my appreciation to all the panelists for their active participation in this discussion. The second segment, the high-level panel discussion on trends, options, and strategies in poverty eradication across the globe is now concluded. And we will now turn to the third segment. And this segment affords member states an opportunity to share the knowledge of good or failed practices in poverty eradication. Before we open the floor for interventions, I would like to reiterate that all participants must turn off their microphones when they're not speaking. And just also to note that there is no pre-established list of speakers for this meeting. So delegates wishing to deliver statements, and I've seen a number of you have already indicated this, you are invited to indicate that you would like to speak by using the chat box. And the chat function is accessible through the button in the menu bar on your screen. Please include the name of your delegation, the title of the speaker, and also if you are speaking on behalf of a group of states in your national capacity, and kindly complete the form. The Secretariat will be monitoring the chat box and will inscribe speakers on the list. I will announce 3 upcoming speakers at a time. After being given the floor, please unmute your microphone and begin to speak. Also make sure your camera is on. And please also, once you've stopped speaking, please remember to mute your microphone back when you're concluded. The speakers will be given the floor in the order of inscription, while those who are speaking on behalf of groups of states will be given priority. And due to the limited time available, we really encourage you to limit your interventions to 5 minutes when speaking on behalf of a group of states, and 3 minutes when speaking in your national capacity. Finally, if you're experiencing internet connectivity and bandwidth issues, turning off your video may resolve the problem. Should you be unable to speak due to technical difficulties, you will be given the floor again after 3 or 4 speakers. In case your internet connection should be interrupted, please go to the meeting invitation and rejoin the meeting in the Cisco WebEx application. If technical problems persist, kindly contact the troubleshooting focal point listed in the invitation email. Thank you very much. First, we will hear a goodwill message from Mr. Naci Abal, President of Strategy and Budget, Presidency of the Republic of Turkey. Please play the video.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, distinguished members of the UN family, it is a great honor for me to address on the occasion of the high-level meeting on poverty eradication. The world is on the edge of an enormous transformation. Many countries have been adversely affected by the coronavirus pandemic. This poses significant threats, especially to less developed countries, as their health systems tend to be weaker. It is expected that COVID-19 could drive global poverty up for the first time since the 1990s. The fight against the pandemic and poverty requires enhanced international cooperation and solidarity. Therefore, as international community, we all must take necessary preventive actions to tackle these problems. Distinguished participants, on this occasion, I would like to share my country's experience in responding to global outbreak. Thanks to our strong public healthcare infrastructure and dedicated healthcare human resources, Turkey has been successful in fighting against COVID-19. Public and private sector has made remarkable investments in healthcare in the past 2 decades. Both the number of cases and mortality rates display our achievement in containing and countering this pandemic in Turkey. All healthcare services, including testing and treatment, is offered free of charge to everyone, including 4 million refugees living in Turkey, in line with our universal healthcare coverage system and no one behind principle. During the outbreak, we also built 2 emergency hospitals in Istanbul within just 45 days. Both hospitals have over 1,000 beds, of which 400 of them have intensive care units. We have launched the Social Protection Shield program to cater to our citizens' urgent needs during the pandemic. This program included services such as short-time work allowance, unemployment benefits, cash support, and social assistance. More than 6 million households have been reached through this program. We also postponed taxes, social security premiums, and loans of many small and medium-sized companies. Turkey not only met the needs of its citizens, but also responded to the needs of more than 130 countries. Turkey is the 3rd largest medical aid and support country in the world. We have been providing medical supplies, including personal protection equipment, ventilators made in Turkey. I wish you great success in your initiative under the Alliance for Poverty Eradication. Thank you very much.
Thanks to the distinguished representative of Turkey for that message. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representatives of Guyana on behalf of the Group of 77 and China, followed by the distinguished representative of the European Union, and then the distinguished representative of Algeria. The floor is yours, Guyana.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the Group of 77 and China. The COVID-19 pandemic is causing devastation and suffering around the world. Hunger and malnutrition on an unprecedented scale. 60 million more people pushed into extreme poverty, up to half the global workforce, 1.6 billion people without livelihoods, and the loss of 8.5 trillion in global output, the sharpest contraction since the Great Depression of the 1930s. Progress in global poverty reduction has stagnated due to factors such as the current global health crisis and resulting economic slowdown, conflicts, and the impacts of climate change. Over the long term, developing countries stand to be impacted the most due to the fragility of our health systems, limited social protection coverage, and our vulnerability to external shocks. Those left behind are becoming increasingly harder to reach, particularly disadvantaged groups. The G77 in China is similarly concerned by the current volatility of global financial markets. Over 100 billion in capital has flowed out of emerging markets since the outbreak of the pandemic, the largest outflow ever recorded. Global trade is expected to plunge between 13 and 32% in 2020. Our greatest concern, however, is for the lives and livelihoods of the poorest and those in vulnerable situations who are the most severely impacted. There is no doubt that the current pandemic is further derailing the efforts by developing countries to implement the Sustainable Development Agenda and is undermining the gains made in recent years. This is a matter of grave concern, as the world is not on track to eradicate extreme poverty by 2030, as called for under Goal 1 of the 2030 Agenda. We therefore reiterate the group's call to strengthen international cooperation, solidarity, and resource mobilization, including the ODA commitments given by developed countries. Our actions must be recalibrated to effectively respond to the pandemic, and measures must be taken to address the root causes, which include climate change, of poverty, hunger, and all forms of malnutrition. The United Nations has a crucial role to play in leading a coordinated global response to these maladies. The pandemic must therefore be treated as an opportunity to rethink our approaches and strategies for the decade of action. Madam Moderator, the eradication of extreme poverty requires investing in policies that are in line with the 2030 Agenda, the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, and the Paris Agreement. In this connection, the group underscores the importance of economic diversification and increased investment and financing in those sectors that are critical to accelerating the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. There is also an urgent need to bridge the digital divide by accelerating the transfer of technologies, including on concessional and preferential terms that are essential for the implementation of a wide range of SDGs. The G77 in China looks forward to further dialogues in this colloquium series as we do to a world without poverty. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative from Guyana for his statement on behalf of the G77 and China, and I'm pleased now to turn the floor to the representative from the European Union.
Thank you, Melissa. Nice to see you. The statement I'm about to deliver is on behalf of the EU and its member states. And I'd like to start by thanking the President of the General Assembly for providing us with the opportunity to address this topic of high relevance today. If we look back, we can acknowledge that the world has made great progress in reducing extreme poverty. Nearly 36% of the world population, which correspond to 1.9 billion people, lived in extreme poverty in 1990. These numbers went down to 10%, or 734 million people, in 2015. So this is good progress, but of course, there are still 734 million too many. And despite this progress, poverty rate remains very high in low-income countries, as well as in fragile and conflict-affected countries. This illustrates the fact that poverty eradication is a constant challenge. And moreover, that the gains which were achieved in the past are threatened today by the COVID-19 crisis and its severe socio-economic consequences. Recent World Bank estimates show that COVID-19 could push 100 million people back into extreme poverty in 2020, leading to the first increase in global extreme poverty in decades. So what is our perspective on poverty? First of all, I'd like to assure you that eradicating poverty in all its dimensions and tackling discriminations and inequalities and leaving no one behind are at the heart of the EU development cooperation policy. We see poverty as a multidimensional challenge related to economic, social, environmental, cultural, and political aspects, which requires a cross-sectoral approach. Tackling the various dimensions of poverty requires actions on all fronts, including education, health, social protection, gender equality, nutrition, and strengthening resilience. The EU's and member states' support and actions under all SDGs contribute to their core objective of eradicating poverty. Eradicating poverty also has to go hand in hand with a special focus on the poorest and most vulnerable countries and sections of society. To help achieve this, the EU is committed to allocating at least 20% of its official development assistance to social inclusion and human development. Given future projections on extreme poverty, the EU and member states have continued to strengthen action to address needs in least developed countries, sub-Saharan Africa, and fragile and conflict-affected areas. The EU and its member states have also addressed the links between poverty, conflict, fragility, and forced displacement in a coherent and comprehensive manner by integrating actions covering, for instance, human rights, food security, education in crisis, rule of law, good governance, climate change, peace and security. Tackling extreme poverty, especially in fragile situations, requires a strengthened link between humanitarian, development, and security actions. Building resilience to shocks and increasing social protection coverage are at the core of EU development strategies for ending extreme poverty. The EU is involved in several global and country programs to strengthen social protection systems and also supports the Universal Social Protection Initiative to promote universal social protection policies, particularly for the poor and the vulnerable. The COVID-19 crisis vividly demonstrated the huge relevance of strong health and social security systems. The EU collectively is the world's leading donor for development cooperation to help overcoming poverty and advancing global development. Collective ODA from the European Union and its member states amounted to 75.2 billion in 2019, representing 55.2% of global assistance. Budget support has been an important delivery modality. The EU disbursed about 18% of its ODA in 2018 through budget support. It involves direct financial transfers through the national treasury of partner countries and is fully aligned with partner countries' own development policies, priorities, and systems. The 90 countries receiving EU budget support achieved strong gains in reducing extreme poverty. Our EU approach to addressing poverty will now integrate the major disruptive impact of the COVID-19 crisis on our partner countries and create a link with the recovery actions. In doing so, it will deliver on the Build Back Better agenda that links recovery and the implementation of the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs. With regard to the COVID-19 crisis, we launched the Team Europe package to support countries in tackling the impact of COVID-19 around the world. Almost 36 billion euros have been mobilized as to date. The package combines resources from the EU, its member states, and financial institutions in order to address the devastating effects of the COVID-19 crisis in partner countries and regions. On the 4th of May, the EU also initiated the global COVID-19 pledging marathon, which to date has raised, after the pledging event of the 27th of June, 15.9 billion euros to accelerate the development and deployment of effective diagnostics, treatments, and vaccines for all, and to tackle the social economic effects of the crisis. Beyond ODA, the EU is helping partner countries to make the most of the diverse financing sources available to them to support the implementation of the SDGs. The EU has been instrumental in bringing together aid, investment, trade, domestic resource mobilization, and policies designed to unlock the full potential of all financial flows. Through the European external investment plans, the EU is on track to leverage over 47 billion euros in investment for Africa and our neighborhood. And the EU also supports partner countries in the fields of domestic resource mobilization. To conclude, financial aid alone is not enough to sustainably reduce poverty. Political action is needed to overcome challenges in governance, trade regimes, and geography, and to make best use of the opportunities arising from globalization. This event clearly illustrates that poverty eradication needs to remain high on the political agenda. And we thank the PGA for providing this opportunity to reflect on the various aspects of poverty and the exchange on the different approaches about what works well in practice in the implementation of the 2030 Agenda, with a clear view of leaving no one behind. Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you very much, Silvio, for your message on behalf of the European Union. It's my pleasure now to give the floor to the distinguished representative from Algeria.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Allow me, first of all, to congratulate the PGA for the launch of the Alliance for Poverty Eradication that my country is to be part of, and for organizing this event, which represent a great opportunity to highlight the major impediments to eradicating poverty in all its forms and dimensions. Eradicating poverty remains one of the greatest global challenges of our times, and an overreaching goal that is still an obstacle in our path towards sustainable development and achieving the 2030 Agenda in its entirety. The poverty rate is expected to rise for the first time since 1998 due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and all progress made in the past 5 years might be reversed. Indeed, new researchers estimates that by 2030, up to 2/3 of the world's extreme poor may live in a fragile and conflicted affected economies, making it clear that unless intensive action is taken, global poverty eradication goals will not be met. This fact is confirmed by the latest report of the Secretary General on the implementation of the third United Nations Decade for Eradicating of Poverty, which highlighted that almost 500 million people will remain in extreme poverty by 2030. Madam Moderator, Algeria remained committed to eradicating poverty. In this regard, the authority drew up in 2000 a national strategy based on 5 national programs focused on the basic needs of disadvantaged groups of the population related to microcredit, agriculture, housing, vocational training, and health. This strategy allows Algeria to successfully reduce extreme poverty from 1.9% in 1988 to 0.8% in 2018, and the poverty rate from 22.5 in 1995 to 5.5 in 2018. Algeria is devoted to continuing its efforts until the total eradication of poverty based on the common denominator human and social development, and the guarantee of a decent life for all citizens. The strategy is based on the implementation of a large-scale development program aimed at meeting the needs of citizens without discrimination through, in particular, free access to basic education and health and promoting ICT. Let me in this regard highlight two elements of our national strategy which adopt a whole of government and a whole of society approach. First, microcredit. This is one of the most important tools that the government uses to create jobs and stimulate economic growth. Several institutions have been created in order to assist in reaching the objectives set out by the government, including a national agency for management of microcredit, a national youth employment support agency, and a national unemployment insurance fund. The second element of the strategy is social protection. Algeria's social security system is universal and compulsory based on the principles of solidarity and inclusiveness. It provides a social coverage to more than 85% of the population. Madam Moderator, in light of our national experience, we believe that tackling poverty and eradicating this scourge requires especially first a long-term strategy and mobilizing adequate resources to its implementation. Second, an international cooperation and solidarity. Third, a realistic strategy adopted to national context and priorities. Fourth, special emphasis to populations in vulnerable situations and to reducing inequalities among regions. And fifth, a reinforcement of the social security system with the aim at reaching universal social security coverage. Finally, Madam Moderator, allow me to express Algeria's commitment to spare no efforts to continue to cooperate with other countries and the UN system to ensure the full implementation of the SDGs and make sure that during the third UN decade for the eradication of poverty, we will be able to accelerate actions and to achieve a world without poverty by 2030 without leaving no country and no one behind. And I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative from Algeria, and it is my pleasure to turn the floor to the distinguished representative from Qatar. You have the floor, Alia.
Thank you so much, Madam Moderator, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. First, I would like to thank the President of the General Assembly, His Excellency Professor Tijani Mohammed Bandi, for his leadership and commitment towards poverty eradication across the world, showcased with the establishment of the Alliance for Poverty Eradication and today's timely high-level meeting. Qatar is deeply committed to the objective of the Alliance as we acknowledge that eradicating poverty in all its forms and dimensions is an indispensable requirement for the achieving of the Sustainable Development Goals, sustaining peace and human rights. Above all, Qatar has joined the Alliance out of our belief in the international solidarity and shared responsibility. We are strongly committed to the global effort to combat the COVID-19 pandemic and to support the recovery efforts of developing countries, including the LDCs. The COVID-19 pandemic is taking its toll on the world, impacting on health and public health, deeply challenging socio-economic and educational systems, food security, and deepening inequalities within and among countries, in some affecting the economic development of countries and regions, rich and poor, and upsetting the lives of billions of people around the world. Qatar is apprehensive with the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic is having on poverty reduction and progress towards Sustainable Development Goals achievement. Even before the pandemic, we were concerned with the pace and scale of global poverty reduction, and we would not be on track to deliver by 2030. In this regard, we strongly support the Secretary General Decade of Action to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals. Qatar has a long-standing commitment to sustainable development and eradicating poverty. I am so proud to note that we have increased the amount of humanitarian and development aid provided through our development cooperation. Qatar Fund for Development has actively participated in the Lives and Livelihoods Fund LLF, the largest development initiative in the Middle East and Africa. working towards improving financing models and innovative partnerships, and focusing on issues of extreme poverty and support for marginalized people with the goal of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Qatar contributed an amount of $50 million out of the total $500 million capital for the LLF, which provides developing countries with development funds estimated at $2 million. In January 2022, in order to help the LDCs address the structural impediments to sustainable development, Qatar will host the 5th United Nations Conference on the Least Developed Countries. This conference is extremely important as a new 10-year program of action for the LDCs will be adopted, and it will coincide with the decade of implementation for the Sustainable Development Goals. Given the global nature of climate change and its impact on sustainable development, Qatar has committed $100 million to support the LDCs and the small island development states with prevention, resilience, and development solutions that lead to greener, more inclusive economies and stronger, more resilient societies. Let's not doubt that the COVID-19 pandemic is an opportunity to build a better, greener world. To conclude, I would like to reaffirm Qatar's strong commitment to the objectives set out in the Alliance for Poverty Eradication, and I thank you, Madam Moderator, again.
Thank you very much to the distinguished representative of Qatar for her statement. And it is my pleasure now to give the floor to the distinguished representative of China. The floor is yours. May I ask the distinguished representative of China to take the floor? Perhaps there is a technical issue. We will, is this the distinguished representative of China? I don't think so. I believe that there must be a technical issue with China. We will come back to you. Please be assured. It is my great pleasure now to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Morocco. Sir, you have the floor.
I thank you very much, my dear USG Lisa Fleming. Mr. President of the General Assembly, Mr. Secretary General, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I'm really honored to take part in this timely high-level meeting on poverty eradication. At the outset, I would like to thank all panelists and speakers for their important input. We are facing a reality today in which the pandemic has exacerbated the existing challenges for sustainable development, particularly the greatest challenge of poverty eradication. Poverty is making the response to the pandemic even harder, and it is undermining the response capacity of many developing countries, particularly in Africa. The Alliance for Poverty Eradication, of which Morocco is proudly a founding member, will be a crucial platform to think collectively and with high spirit of cooperation and multilateralism of concrete policy recommendation and solution to advance the implementation of the SDG 1 and its targets. The fight against poverty in all its form and dimension has always been among the national priorities in Morocco. Under the leadership of His Majesty King Mohammed VI, Morocco has engaged in several projects and initiatives for poverty eradication, focusing on establishing an inclusive society, widening access to basic social services, and developing a strong social protection system, and thus consolidating the implementation of the principle of the leaving no one behind advocated by the 2030 agenda. In this regard, I would like to share briefly 4 Moroccan policies among many others that resulted in advancing poverty eradication at the national level and the implementation of many targets of SDG 1. First, the National Initiative for Human Development, launched 15 years ago. It constitutes a central long-term strategy in the fight against poverty in many countries. In my country, it focused in the third phases for 2019-2023 on strengthening basic infrastructure and social services, supporting people in vulnerable situations, including the elderly, sick or disabled, improving income and the economic and financial inclusion of young people and women. 2. The Green Morocco Plan, in particular its Pillar 2, which is intended for the modernization of solidarity framing and the fight against poverty for small farmers. 3. Social protection and medical coverage strategies. The medical coverage rates reached almost 68.8 in 2019 instead of 52 in 2015. Thanks to the expansion of the medical assistance plans, RAMID, the introduction of compulsory health insurance and social security system for the self-employed. 4. Finally, there are ongoing new projects focusing on the rural areas, enhancing the financial inclusion of the rural population and mountain areas, as well as improving their quality of life and promoting their access to eradication services, health, drinking water, electrification, and rural roads. It goes without saying that eradicating poverty around the world can't be done in silos. The Kingdom of Morocco strongly believes in the power of partnership and multilateral cooperation for eradicating poverty. With this spirit, we have made partnership one of the pillars of the Moroccan foreign policy. We place the African continent at the center of our South-South and triangular cooperation strategies. We have multiplied partnership agreements and initiatives in Africa aiming at sharing best practices, stimulating investment, and accelerating the implementation for sustainable development goals. And finally, with the same spirit of solidarity and cooperation, and within our effort of ensuring an effective response to COVID-19 pandemic, His Majesty King Mohammed VI launched an initiative by African head of states and government aimed at establishing an operational framework to work with the African countries in the fight against the pandemic. Moreover, and very recently, Morocco has sent medical aid to the African Union Commission and to 20 African countries in order to counter the coronavirus outbreak in a new expression of intra-African solidarity. The fight against devastating effects of the pandemic must bring a huge focus on poverty eradication as a root source of vulnerability. The international community is urged to exercise a strong multilateralism for accelerating the implementation of SDG 1. I thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Morocco, and I understand the distinguished representative of China is back and ready to take the floor. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam President. So good to see you here. I just came from the Security Council meeting on the Iranian nuclear issue. I'm sorry I have missed part of this important meeting, but I do attach great importance to this meeting. First, let me start by expressing my heartfelt congratulations to the founding of this Alliance for Poverty Eradication under the initiative of the President of the General Assembly. It's indeed a very, very meaningful step forward. Ending poverty is a common ideal of mankind and a big challenge that requires hard work of generations of people. The founding of the UN has brought new hope to the world community. Under the under UN's leadership, the world community has never wavered its commitment to reducing poverty. From the MDGs to SDGs, poverty eradication has been on the top of the list. Thanks to the concerted efforts of the international community, the share of global population living in extreme poverty has dropped from 36% in 1990 to the current level of around 10%. This year, we are marking the 75th anniversary of the founding of the UN and entering the decade of action for the SDGs. However, the COVID-19 pandemic is posing severe challenges to poverty eradication. We should seize the opportunity of the launching of the Alliance to take joint actions and move forward the global cause of poverty eradication. First, we should take development as the top priority. Development is a constant pursuit of human society. The 2030 Agenda has charted the course for global development and requires earnest implementation. We should prioritize development in global macro policy coordination and address poverty through development. Countries need to act with greater urgency, increase input into development, and formulate policies for development and poverty reduction based on national conditions. China has always put development at the center of its work, and we commit to mobilize the engagement of all social sectors in poverty reduction and form synergy among government, communities, and the market players. And we benefit greatly from this approach. Second, we should put people first. Advancing people's well-being should always be the goal of our work. China is committed to delivering a better life to the people. People are at the center of development and the fight against poverty. From 2012 to 2019, poor population in China dropped from nearly 99 million to 5.5 million, and the poverty occurrence rate fell from 10.2% to 0.6%. In 2020, China is on track to lift all its rural poor out of poverty under the current poverty line and achieve relevant goals and targets set in the 2030 Agenda 10 years ahead of schedule. Third, we should work in a down-to-earth manner. Poverty won't be ended overnight. We need perseverance and concrete actions. For years, China has been guided by a vision of innovative, coordinated, green, open, and shared development to achieve better quality and efficiency in combating poverty. Targeted and tailored measures have been adopted to help the disadvantaged groups and ensure that no one is left behind. With the spread of COVID-19 brought under control, China is working hard to achieve recovery and helping those in need on a priority basis so as to minimize the impact of COVID-19 and meet the poverty reduction goals and the targets as scheduled. Fourth, we should remain committed to international cooperation. The international community should firmly uphold multilateralism, jointly tackle the challenges posed by COVID-19, help developing countries strengthen capacity building, and increase cooperation in digital economy, clean energy, 5G, and other new business areas to promote inclusive and sustainable growth. China has been advocating South-South cooperation on poverty reduction and sharing its good practices. The Belt and Road Initiative serves to help relevant countries increase jobs and improve livelihoods. According to the estimates, thanks to the BRI, 7.6 million people will be lifted out of extreme poverty and 32 million out of moderate poverty. China is taking real actions to advance global cause of poverty reduction. As President Xi Jinping announced China will provide $2 billion as international assistance within 2 years, and we will cancel interest-free government loans owed by African countries that will mature by the end of 2020 under FOCAC framework, that's China African Cooperation Framework, and work with G20 members to implement the further extend debt service suspension initiative. Madam President, dear colleagues, the world is fighting a more difficult battle against poverty. Let's work together through this alliance and push for new progress in poverty reduction to the benefits of people of all countries. And thank you.
I thank the distinguished PR representative of China for his statement, and I'm pleased to hand the floor to the distinguished representative of Nepal.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Mr. President of the General Assembly, Excellencies, distinguished delegates. At the outset, I'd like to thank the President of the General Assembly for organizing this timely event. And I also thank the UN Secretary General and other panelists for their insightful remarks. And I align my statement with the statement delivered by Guyana on behalf of the Group of 77 in China. Madam Moderator, Mr. President, eradicating poverty in all its forms and dimensions is a daunting global challenge. If we believe in morality of humanity, how is it moral to have over 700 million people on extreme poverty and 1.3 billion people under multidimensional poverty, while the same world rejoices in accumulating the heap of $360 trillion wealth? Something has gone terribly wrong. Evidently, it is not an issue of lack of resources. It is certainly an issue of political will and the choice of right policy courses and the genuine actions to utilize the resources that we have towards ending extreme poverty. COVID-19 has brought unprecedented challenges, particularly in LDCs, LLDCs, and seeds. The pandemic is therefore adding more hardship to those left behind, and it is becoming increasingly harder to catch up with the rest of the world. Mr. President, Nepal has been implementing the integrated and targeted poverty alleviation programs and has made significant progress. Yet, poverty has remained as a major impediment to our socioeconomic development. The government is now focused to bring an accelerated economic development with a motto of prosperous Nepal, happy Nepali, despite unprecedented hardship that COVID-19 has imposed in our economy. To conclude, Mr. President, urgent and united global actions are needed more than ever before. Hence, integrated, inclusive, coordinated, and coherent approach at national, regional, and global levels is a key for ending extreme poverty for all people everywhere by 2030, as we agreed on SDG 1. I thank you, Madam Moderator. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Nepal for his statement, and it is my pleasure to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Spain.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. Thank you for this meeting, which is a great opportunity to address a major concern for the international community. Eradicating poverty in all its forms is the greatest global challenge faced by humanity. This need is currently more evident as COVID-19 threatens to reverse decades of progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. Poverty is undoubtedly related to income. We are well aware of this in Spain, where we have recently introduced a minimum living income that will benefit 850,000 families. It will entail an annual investment of more than 3,000 million euro by the government and lift more than 1.5 million people out of poverty. 30% of the beneficiaries are under 18. This is a measure compatible with other job income and with other public aids, scholarships. However, poverty has other dimensions: health, education, food security, or sanitation, to name only a few. We must therefore address poverty eradication in a comprehensive and multidimensional way, as stated in the 2030 Agenda. We believe that the Alliance for the Eradication of Poverty, in accordance with the multidimensional nature of poverty, should contribute to promote the Decade of Action for Sustainable Development in order to provide a response that addresses the root causes of poverty, respond to this crisis, taking into account the importance of preventing future crises, consider the rest of the SDGs in order to be consistent with the indivisibility of the SDGs, enhance synergies, and achieve a multiplier effect in our actions. And finally, we must measure poverty in a multidimensional way. The UNDP produces a multidimensional poverty index, which takes into account 3 levels: health, education, and standard of living. It is a step in the right direction to assess poverty in a comprehensive way. Thank you very much, Madam Moderator.
I thank the distinguished representative of Spain for her statement, and it is my pleasure to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Guatemala.
Thank you. Thank you, SG Melissa Fleming. I would like to thank the President of the General Assembly for convening this high-level meeting on poverty eradication across the world that will serve to mark the launching of the Alliance of Poverty Eradication. You have Guatemala's full support. It is no coincidence that the Sustainable Development Goal #1 is to end poverty in all its forms, everywhere. It is our overreaching goal, the reason of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and of our global efforts. All countries on the planet face poverty challenges, and we must face these challenges together. Poverty is part of a broader set of interrelated issues that cut across all 3 pillars of the UN Charter. We see poverty, inequalities, and social exclusion as factors that aggravate conflicts and hinder the building of peaceful, just, and inclusive societies. We see upholding human rights for all as sine qua non condition for achieving progress in all areas of sustainable development, including poverty eradication. Indeed, the relationship between sustainable development, peace, and human rights is a 3-way symbiotic one. We all 3 areas benefit from the success of the others. Therefore, we see poverty eradication through a holistic lens. I fully subscribe to the concept of sustaining peace, and it is key to address all 3 pillars in a cross-cutting manner. In Guatemala, after having fully aligned our National Development Plan with 2030 Agenda, we designed a 2-pronged strategy for poverty reduction and social protection that has human rights as the underlying factor. Among Latin American countries, Guatemala is one of the most affected by different nutritional problems. That's why our government has prioritized the implementation of the Great Crusade National for Nutrition, which seeks to unite all sectors of the country in order to improve the nutrition of Guatemalan families, but mostly in focus on the poorest and most marginalized areas of Guatemala, applying a comprehensive approach that responds to the multi-causality of the problem. Among the many economic measures we take, we are creating several revolving funds to support access to credit for most small and medium enterprises, to assist with mortgage payments, to alleviate unemployment and support the most vulnerable populations. Gender equality is a priority for us, and we recognize that women and girls are more at risk of entering a situation of poverty, notably in the context of the pandemic. We also recognize the need to step up efforts to provide access to sexual and reproductive health services, as we are concerned about undesired pregnancies and a rise in births in population groups that were maternal mortality rates. Guatemala values this space as a platform to explore the best ways to address poverty eradication that, in our opinion, will require deep structural changes in national and global economies and safeguard the most vulnerable from united market failures. We look forward to continuing the discussion, and you can count on our support. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Guatemala, and I'd like to just announce that the speakers list must close due to time constraints. And also due to time constraints, if we can ask the forthcoming speakers to reduce the time of your statements to 2 minutes, if possible, so that we can allow everybody to have a chance to speak. My next speaker is the distinguished representative from Sierra Leone. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes, okay. Mr. President of the General Assembly, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, let me start out by thanking Mr. President for his tremendous effort in holding this high-level meeting on the trends and options and strategies in poverty eradication. The establishment of the Alliance for Poverty Eradication is very much timely, given the socioeconomic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. And also let me say that I'm aligning my statement with that of the one delivered by the distinguished representative of Guyana on behalf of the Group of 77 and China. It is disheartening that the progress made to reduce poverty around the world has lagged significantly over the years. This is explained by factors such as current global health crisis, economic slowdown, conflict, and climate change impacts. Developing countries, and especially countries in fragile situations, stand to be impacted the most in the long term due to the fragility of health systems, limited social protection coverage, as well as vulnerability to external shocks. Those left behind are becoming increasingly harder to reach, particularly those in vulnerable situations. The 2030 Agenda acknowledges that eradicating poverty in all its forms and dimensions, including extreme poverty, is the greatest global challenge and an indispensable requirement for sustainable development. The first Sustainable Development Goal aims to end poverty in all its forms everywhere. Its 7 associated targets, among others, to eradicate extreme poverty for all people everywhere, reduce at least by half the proportion of men, women, and children of all ages living in extreme poverty, and implement nationally appropriate social protection system and measures for all, including basic flood measures by 2030, clearly stands out as worthy goals as of today. In Sierra Leone, the fight against poverty has been fought since the end of the Civil War in 2002, with the implementation of 3 poverty reduction strategy plans. However, despite Sierra Leone's important progress in consolidating peace, strengthening democracy, and reducing poverty since the end of the conflict, and with a specific focus on human capital development, around 50% of the population still lives below the national poverty line. It is against this background that we joined the Alliance for Poverty Reduction initiative to share our experiences and also learn lessons from other countries. Mr. President, it is imperative that in order to eradicate extreme poverty, there is need to invest in policies that are in line with the 2030 Agenda, the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. It is therefore our considered view that economic diversification and improving investment and financing in sectors that are crucial to accelerating the achievement of the 2030 Agenda are urgently needed to strengthen the fight against poverty. In this regard, Sierra Leone aligned the Sustainable Development Goals with our national development plans, with economic diversification as one of its main pillars. In addition, to effectively diversify the economies of developing countries, there is need to bridge the digital divide in order to accelerate the transfer of technologies, including on concessional and preferential terms that are essential for implementing a wide range of SDGs. Let me conclude, Mr. President, that today we have witnessed, even before the outbreak of the current global pandemic, an increase in the number of people living in absolute poverty, particularly in developing countries. The enormity and complexity of the poverty issue could endanger the social fabric, undermine economic development and environment, and threaten political stability in many, many countries. This initiative, the Alliance for Poverty Eradication, gives us a unique opportunity to do something about this right now. I thank you for your kind attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Sierra Leone for his statement, and it is my pleasure to introduce the next three speakers. The first speaker will be Kazakhstan on behalf of landlocked developed countries, followed by Cuba, and followed by Namibia. So I would like now to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kazakhstan.
Thank you, Melissa, for giving me the floor. I actually ascribed to the list to speak on behalf of landlocked developing countries from the very beginning, but probably there was a problem with the protocol order with the list. But I would like to deliver the statement on behalf of the landlocked developing countries. I wish to thank the President of the General Assembly for convening today's important meeting on inauguration of the United Nations Alliance for Poverty Eradication. Our group looks forward to working closely with the Alliance. Achieving the key principle behind the 2030 Agenda for leaving no one behind requires special attention to the LLDC's development. Its population of over 500 million remains amongst the most vulnerable in the world due to the lack of territorial access to the sea and remoteness from international markets. Before the onset of the COVID-19 crisis, when we held a comprehensive high-level midterm review of the Vienna Program of Action for LLDCs last December, the population living below the poverty line in the 32 LLDCs was almost 30%. The COVID-19 pandemic is pushing many people back into extreme poverty, putting years of progress at risk. It is now very urgent that we safeguard past gains and double our efforts to eradicate poverty in LLDCs. Let me briefly propose a few suggestions that are of critical importance to support these efforts. First, the LLDCs need international support to increase their trade potential and growth by creating more export opportunities. Second, LLDCs require support in enhancing their industrial capacity and stimulating structural economic transformation. Initiative to support medium and small enterprises must be developed quickly for maximum effect in the face of the COVID-19 crisis. Third, LLDCs need support to establish effective social protection schemes and policies and channel investments. Addressing climate change and desertification is critical. Fourth, enhanced partnerships at all levels are key to addressing the impacts of COVID-19 and sustainable poverty eradication. Enhanced UN support is needed to enable the LLDCs to implement the Vienna Program of Action and achieve the SDGs as a whole. In this respect, a UN roadmap for the accelerated implementation of Vienna Program of Action is being prepared today. Fifth, solutions that work on the ground need to be scaled up and replicated. Sharing of experiences among countries is critical. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative for Kazakhstan for his statement on behalf of landlocked developing countries. And it is my pleasure now to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cuba.
Thank you, Chair. I wish to thank His Excellency Mr. Tijani Mohamed Bandi, President of the General Assembly, for the launching of this very important and timely initiative. Cuba firmly believes that the eradication of poverty in all its forms and dimensions, including extreme poverty, is the greatest challenge facing humanity, and its elimination is a prerequisite for achieving sustainable development. In that regard, my delegation understands that in order to eliminate poverty, it's not sufficient to tackle or measure income inequality. It is necessary the creation of opportunities and rights for all, to exercise basic human dimensions such as education, health, employment, safety and social assistance, food and nutrition, legal guarantees, access to culture, sports, and recreation, among others, all of which guarantee not only material satisfaction, but also integral human development. That has been the experience and practice of Cuba. For example, Different levels of monetary income do not deprive Cubans of access to services in the above-mentioned areas, ensuring universal and free access to social services such as education and health for all, while many others are highly subsidized. Cuba stands out for having a higher than expected achievement in most of the multidimensional progress indicators. In health, for example, my country excels in child nutrition, maternal and infant mortality rates, and life expectancy. The same is true for education indicators such as average cumulative schooling, coverage and the secondary level, school dropout rates, and student-teacher ratios at the basic level. With regard to access to public services such as water coverage, basic sanitation, and rural electrification, their situation is also more positive and their income level reduced. Cuba stands as the only country in Latin America and the Caribbean that has eliminated severe child malnutrition, according to the UNICEF, and the fifth country among the first 14 that have managed to steadily reduce the index of hunger and malnutrition for several years, according to the Global Food Policy Report. At the global level, we firmly believe that the eradication of poverty in all its forms and dimensions can only be achieved if the root developmental causes that create and perpetuate underdevelopment are eliminated. For that, beyond any commitment and reaffirmation of compromises already made, it is necessary a real political will, solidarity, multilateral cooperation, social justice, and equality. If we really want to leave no country and no one behind, including the fulfillment of the right to development for all. The current unjust and unsustainable international economic order, where unilateralism, protectionism, unilateral coercive economic measures, and inequalities proliferate, creates a global economic environment that hampers the capacity of developing countries to address the root causes of underdevelopment at the national level and achieve an inclusive and enabling environment of growth and development for all and close the gap with developed countries. Also, together with the solidarity and cooperation of the international community, including the central role of the United Nations system, we believe that South-South cooperation makes a significant contribution to our collective endeavors to address the eradication of poverty, including in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. During this trying time, the international community, developed and developing countries alike, must demonstrate more than ever our capability to work together in solidarity. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Cuba for her statement, and I'm pleased now to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Namibia.
Madam Moderator, distinguished colleagues, the struggles for freedom and democracy, political independence, and the right to self-determination had largely been achieved, save for the few outstanding cases still under occupation that we should still work for. However, we know it for a fact that we cannot eat democracy or political freedom. For us to truly be free and live in a world in which no one is left behind, we must win the next struggle, that of economic freedom. The late Kofi Annan, former Secretary General of the United Nations, cautioned us that extreme poverty anywhere in the world is a threat to human security everywhere. It is therefore not surprising to me that in our agenda for sustainable development, we have identified that our #1 target to achieve is to eradicate poverty. For there can be no argument that poverty interlinks with so many more challenges that collectively deny people their right to a decent life. It is only by defeating the scourge of poverty that we will succeed in addressing the challenges of overcoming inequality in health, education, jobs, sustainable development, and general well-being. I therefore join colleagues in congratulating you, Mr. President, on the formation of the Alliance for Poverty Eradication. This alliance is critical
as the world battles to deal with the unprecedented COVID-19 pandemic and its consequences. Poverty is a global development challenge to which Namibia has devoted considerable attention and efforts over the years. As a result, Namibia has seen significant declines in poverty rates between 2003 and 2004 and 2015 to 2016, owing to robust social safety nets programs introduced by the government. According to the latest statistics, poverty rate stands at 17.8% in Namibia. Notwithstanding the successes on the poverty front, the same cannot be said about income inequality, which remains quite high. Inequality remains one of the causes of poverty in the country, due mainly to the skewed distribution of income and resources. The launch, therefore, of this alliance today resonates well with our national priorities, policies, plans, and strategies. As this launch coincides with the international efforts of the fight against COVID-19, Namibia cautions that there should be no trade-off between public health and poverty eradication. Namibia thus wishes to emphasize that partnership and solidarity are more than ever essential in mobilizing global solutions for global challenges, including in addressing the specific challenges faced by countries listed as middle-income countries in pursuing sustainable development. In conclusion, Madam Moderator, the late great President Nelson Mandela taught us that overcoming poverty is not a gesture of charity. It is the protection of a fundamental human right, the right to dignity and a decent life. I therefore believe that for us to foster a world in which we value human dignity, human life, and peaceful coexistence, we need to drastically act to fight against poverty and hunger. For this, we need collaboration and solidarity at global level to demonstrate and give concrete expression to our collective desire to serve we the peoples of the world better. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Namibia for that statement. And I will now provide the next three speakers or announce the next three speakers. These are France, Sri Lanka, and Indonesia. I would like to now ask the distinguished representative of France to take the floor.
Thank you very much. And I would like also to thank the PGA, the Secretary General, and all the briefers for the very enriching interventions. As we celebrate the 75th anniversary of the UN, as we enter the decade of action, and also as we are facing altogether this pandemic, the eradication of poverty remains a top priority for France. As the Secretary General said, we cannot go back to the to where things were. Eradicating poverty means to redouble efforts to achieve the objectives of Agenda 2030, with a particular emphasis on reducing inequalities at all levels and build more just and more inclusive societies through a more sustainable development path in line with the Paris Agreement. So beyond the immediate humanitarian consequences of the pandemic, the economic recession could wipe out a decade of progress in eradicating poverty if we do not act collectively now. And the economic impact of COVID-19 crisis could require up to, I think, more than $2 billion to respond to the health and humanitarian consequences of the pandemic alone. And that is why France is willing and wants to take full responsibility in this fight by providing emergency aid to contribute to debt relief. So debt relief is important, to increase food security and to improve the health emergency response and resilience in the most vulnerable countries. So our emergency food and nutritional assistance has been increased by more than 32 million euros. We have also contributed up to 1.2 billion in loans and grants, mainly to the French Development Agency, with a priority to African countries in fighting the spread of COVID-19. And so just to conclude, we want to reaffirm the need to address the phenomenon of extreme poverty through an intergenerational and just transition. And so we wish you very good luck and much success with the new alliance.
Thank you very much to the representative of France for her statement, and also for keeping it short. As you all may be aware, and you see, we are really running out of time. So if we could ask the remaining distinguished delegates to, do make your statements, but perhaps in a condensed form. And there, we would love it if you would be able to submit your full statement in writing, if time doesn't permit you to read it in full, if it's not already a 2-minute statement. And information about how you can submit your written statement will be available in the chat box. So I would like now to hand the floor to the distinguished delegate from Sri Lanka. You have the floor. May I ask the distinguished delegate of Sri Lanka to take the floor? I believe we will come back to you if you indicate that you are still there. Oh, you're here. Okay, please, please do come in.
I'm mute.
You are here now. You are here now. I hear you and I see you. So very good. Over to you. Now you are muted again. Could you unmute, please?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Thank you. I wish to congratulate the President of the General Assembly for his timely initiative to convene this high-level meeting, especially when the world is experiencing an unprecedented health and humanitarian crisis and an accompanying socio-economic catastrophe of unparalleled proportions, which have severely impacted globally and in particular the poor. Sri Lanka is pleased to join the Alliance of Poverty Eradication and was encouraged by the positive and proactive discussion held during the informal meeting last week. My delegation aligns itself with the statement made by Guyana on behalf of the G77 and China. During the past few decades, the world had made several considerable progress in eradicating poverty. The MDGs had raised over 1 billion people out of poverty, with this segment continuing to rise during the last 5 years since the launch of the SDGs. However, in a blink of an eye, the COVID-19 pandemic has sought to reverse these hard-won gains and plunged humankind into exacerbated poverty. It has created significant existential challenges to the international community, with global value chains derailed only to give way to a host of socio-economic adversities. This crisis, accompanying the pandemic, has led to job losses, food insecurity, reduction of remittances, rising prices, and lack of access to services such as healthcare and education, thereby aggravating the challenges for developing economies. The World Bank, in its Global Economic Prospects report launched this month, envisions the deepest global recession since World War II, with the contraction of the global GDP by 5.2% in 2020. It is estimated that around 60 million people will fall into extreme poverty this year as a result of this pandemic. These are indeed alarming figures and have significant ramifications for the poor, more so in developing nations. Such multidimensional and severe consequences require a concerted and effective response from both the international community and individual nations. In this context, we believe that the initiative to establish a global fund for social protection could be a step in the right direction. Sri Lanka has set in place several long-term strategies to address the root causes of poverty, as well as immediate measures to respond to the economic consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. Such initiatives include social protection measures, strategies to uplift the rural poor, assistance to SMEs, and safeguarding those employed in the informal sector. Due to the international consequences of the pandemic, the government of Sri Lanka is pursuing a policy to enhance the agriculture sector in order to increase agricultural produce for domestic consumption. Rural agricultural communities are highly vulnerable to poverty, and the government has introduced measures to make subsistence farmers become profit-oriented entrepreneurs. In addition, strategies have been implemented to assist livestock and poultry farmers to increase production with the aim of entering the export market. Excellencies, Sri Lanka has also put in place rapid, enhanced, and effective measures to combat the economic fallout of the pandemic, particularly to mitigate its impact on the poor and small-scale businesses. In April 2020, the government introduced additional cash transfers to support the incomes of the Samudri recipients, as well as the more vulnerable groups of such as the elderly, disabled persons in the agricultural community. Despite the success of these measures, Sri Lanka still faces challenges in its efforts to eradicate poverty. Climate change and global economic shocks have severe impacts on the fragile economies in developing nations. Middle-income countries, such as mine, where over 60% of the world's poor live, cannot fight this battle alone. The world can no longer afford to focus only on the low-income countries in their efforts to eradicate poverty, particularly after the pandemic. Concerted domestic measures complemented by strong international partnerships, which must include global financial institutions, has to be a route to make progress in the future. It is also imperative for international financial institutions to recognize the unique requirements of the middle-income countries and forge a dialogue with them as a segment to achieve a world free of poverty and prosperity by 2030 and leave no one behind. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Sri Lanka, and it is my pleasure to give the floor to the distinguished delegate of Indonesia. Is the distinguished delegate of Indonesia available to speak? If that is not the case now, and you would still like to speak before we close the session, please indicate that in the chat. I will now move to the next three speakers, Uruguay, Peru, and Zimbabwe. And may I please ask the distinguished delegate of Uruguay to take the floor.
Thank you very much. Uruguay is grateful for this, the leadership of the President of the General Assembly in preparing and convening this meeting, which is obviously under coming very in a very good time. And obviously, this meeting marks the formal inauguration of the Alliance for Poverty Eradication. We value the presentation by the Secretary General, the Deputy Secretary General, the President of ECOSOC, and the Secretary of ECLAC, Alicia Vaz. Last week, Uruguay announced its support for this timely initiative. We hope that today be the first of many meetings of the Alliance in the near future, and that those meetings may have the attendance of ministers and high-level authorities in Europe. The forum that is being launched arrives in a very particular moment, in the beginning of the decade of action to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals, but also during the COVID-19 pandemic that has generated a devastating health, socioeconomic, and humanitarian global crisis. As the Agenda 2030 indicates, the eradication of poverty in all its form and dimension is the main goal of our endeavor for the day. We must face the current challenge and build back better from the pandemic, addressing the fragilities and vulnerabilities that the crisis is clearly exposed. Uruguay has achieved important progresses in the eradication of the poverty and extreme poverty during the last 15 years. My country has a low level of inequality and poverty, and the almost complete absence of extreme poverty, with a larger middle class in Latin America, which represents more than 60% of our population. We are also positioned among the first places in the region in relation to various well-being indices. In this case, we are ready to share this good practice and public policies in the context of the alliance with those interested member states. However, in spite of being a high-income developing country, due to the in part successful policies implemented, the current crisis has evidence that the structural persistent gaps and vulnerabilities that Uruguay and other countries that have crossed the upper middle income threshold still face or still have. In this regard, we are considering that the United Nations system should recognize urgently the multidimensional nature of development and poverty and the social, economic, and environmental dimension of domestic output and its structural gaps at all levels. In consultation with the international financial institution, transparent measurement of progress on sustainable development that would go beyond per capita income should be devised. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Uruguay for his statement. And I'd now like to give the floor to the distinguished delegate of Peru.
Thank you very much, Melissa. You hear me well? Hello?
Yes, yes, we hear you loud and clear, and now we see you. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to thank the President of the General Assembly, Tijani Muhammad Bande, for forging this important alliance, which is now more relevant than ever, as well to all the participants and speakers today. Peru is a firm supporter of the alliance. We believe in the nobility of its objectives and consider that it's launching the beginning of the decade of action and results, 75th anniversary of the UN, and the complex context due to COVID-19 could have not been at a more opportune time. As it is known, COVID-19 will not only affect the progress of the SDGs, but will have as one of its deepest consequences the increase in the number of people living in poverty and extreme poverty. To fight this global outbreak and its consequences, we deem necessary a global response supported by the multilateral system and agencies, which entails the making of COVID-19 treatments and vaccines accessible to all, including people living in poverty, and maintaining the supply chain of medical supplies, agricultural products, and other goods and services in order to minimize the impact of the most vulnerable sectors of our societies, particularly those living in poverty. I would like to mention that at the international level, Peru has supported a number of initiatives to eradicate poverty and has also contributed to the establishment of international standards on this issue. At a national level, we have taken various measures to eradicate poverty, achieving a significant reduction of people living in this situation in recent decades. At the beginning of this year, we have reduced poverty to 21%. Recently, and due to the pandemic, we launched an economic stimulus package composing 70% of our GDP, centered on those who are furthest behind, the poor. I'll stop here, and I thank you very much, Melissa.
Thank you very much to the distinguished delegate of Peru, and I'd now like to turn the floor to our last speaker. I'm very sorry to those of you who weren't able to speak, but just like to emphasize that it is possible to submit your statements in writing. This is due to the time constraints. We have already gone over time. Thank you for your understanding. The next and last speaker is the distinguished representative from Zimbabwe.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator, and thank you for giving me the floor as the last speaker of the event. We are truly honored. Let me join others for commending the PGA for coming up with this noble initiative as well as convening this important meeting. The COVID-19 pandemic underscores the need to fight poverty in all its dimensions, and the solution lies in our collective resolve to fight this scourge as we build back better in the aftermath of the pandemic. For us in Zimbabwe, this initiative resonates with our national aspirations to eradicate poverty with the goal of attaining an upper middle income status by 2030. We believe that there's a direct link between poverty, inequality, access to education and health, peace and security, creation of decent jobs for all, and economic growth. The COVID-19 pandemic hit Zimbabwe at a time when the government had targeted an economic rebound through the implementation of the Transitional Stabilization Program designed to transform the economy through the implementation of strategies which are people-centered to empower its people to be self-sufficient and resilient. We are a strong advocate of industrialization and value addition, particularly in small and medium enterprises and the informal sector. Ambitious reforms are currently underway through deliberate policies to deregulate the economy, devolving key functions to sub-national levels and giving financial and technical support to the informal sector. Eradicating poverty is essentially about survival and human dignity. Therefore, let us form a united front against poverty in this decade of action and deliver on sustainable development goals. Most poverty reduction strategies were created in the last century and are based on assumptions that they are no longer necessarily valid. We need 21st century solutions to this problem. The initiative to establish this alliance is thus in line with that drive to change the situation. As we look forward to recovering from the COVID-19 crisis, our focus should now be extended to broader issues such as gender inequalities and exclusion, as well as climate change. The solutions should incorporate a broader view of poverty that looks beyond incomes, but rather include the broadening of social protection and its linkage with economic inclusion strategies. Zimbabwe commits to contribute meaningfully to the work of the Alliance. And in conclusion, Madam Moderator, allow me to congratulate my dear brother Samson on his appointment as interim coordinator of the Alliance. You are assured of Zimbabwe's support. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Zimbabwe for her statement, and I thank all the distinguished delegates who gathered here today and who have shared your experiences, your concerns, and your good practices in poverty eradication. I think there was one word that I kept hearing, and I think that we'll all agree on its importance, and that was dignity. We have now heard the last speaker, and again, many apologies to those of you who weren't able to physically take the floor, virtually take the floor, but we will be circulating your statements in writing. And it is my pleasure now to give the floor to Mr. Tijani Muhammad Bande, the President of the General Assembly, for the closing segment. Thank you very much.
Excellencies, I would like to thank all participants for their valuable contributions, in particular from what our sister, the USG, Melissa Fleming has stated, the notion of dignity as key to the issue really sums it for us. And it is really because of this notion of dignity of individuals, and with that, the dignity and self-respect of communities, that we think this alliance is key to the work of the United Nations more broadly, whether you talk of peace or development or rights, and that's the whole idea of all the three pillars of the work of the UN are connected to this notion of dignity. I think I would like to emphasize, Excellencies, the importance of this alliance once again, and to thank all participants. Let me then make final remarks. Excellencies, distinguished participants, permit me to start by thanking you all for making time to be at this event. The first, and what I hope will be the first in which will be a long series of policy dialogues on the important theme of poverty eradication. I also wish to place on record my appreciation to the enthusiastic support that you have all extended to the initiative on poverty eradication. By joining the newly integrated Alliance for Poverty Eradication, several member states have demonstrated their willingness not only to give practical expression to the internationally agreed sustainable development goals, but also stand in solidarity with the destitute and poor communities in the world. I take the opportunity to thank the founding members of the Alliance, as well as other member states that are weighing the option of joining. I must also express my deepest gratitude to the deepest gratitude of my office to the eminent line of speakers at the high-level meetings opening segment. I refer particularly to President Muhammad Buhari of Nigeria, the Secretary General of the United Nations, the President of ECOSOC, honorable ministers from Pakistan and Turkey, and the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. The panel discussion segment also featured thought-provoking and policy-targeted presentations on different aspects of the meeting's theme. Time will not allow me to provide a detailed summary of each panelist's conclusions and recommendations. Fortunately, rapporteurs are on hand, capturing the highlights of the framing of the subject by President Muhammad Buhari of Nigeria and presentations by the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, the Director General of the ILO, the Secretary General of UNCTAD, the Director General of FAO, the Secretary of the UN Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, the head of the World Bank's New York office, and Associate Administrator of the UNDP. The high-level panel, in different ways, combines pragmatic poverty eradication options and strategies, besides indicating the methods to apply to align those strategies with medium-term and long-term plans. My summary of today's events will not be complete if it omits the contribution of the distinguished representatives of member states who have given valuable contributions to discussions relating to the experiences of their states, but also the connection of their states' efforts to the global effort to fight this scourge. And their participation really has enriched and is really key to the continuation of this alliance. Taken together, the interventions of various segments of this high-level meeting have enhanced our understanding of the challenges in and the opportunities for poverty eradication. I'm therefore confident that by the time that the report of today's event is circulated, of course, this will include statements from those who are unable, because of time constraint, to take the floor, even if virtually. So this will be also included in the summary. Our knowledge of what constitutes good practices in poverty eradication would have been increased. At the very least, the high-level meeting has pinned poverty down as a hydra-headed monster that can only be attacked and defeated with a multi-pronged and well-coordinated strategy. It's no longer news that globally 1 in 12 people live in extreme poverty, that 1 in 9 persons lack access to food, and that 5 in 10 persons are not covered by essential healthcare and social protection insurance. While governments have the primary responsibility for implementing poverty eradication programs within the context of the 2030 agenda, today's high-level meeting has underscored the necessity to forge mutually beneficial partnerships with the private sector, the youth, civil society, and academic organizations in general. As if poverty eradication is not a hidden challenge by itself, the world was confronted and is being confronted still with the devastation and uncertainties of the COVID-19 pandemic. This malady, which added to the challenge of poverty eradication, has also opened our eyes to the likely disruptions in the future and hence the need to better prepare for them. The emerging consensus is that the pandemic will impact heavily on the capacities of least developed countries to eradicate poverty without external assistance. It's my hope that the spirit of international cooperation, which informed the establishment of the United Nations, will also influence the choices of member states in matters pertaining to poverty eradication worldwide. Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, in this respect, I count on the newly inaugurated Alliance for Poverty Eradication to serve as the leading voice on poverty eradication and to continue raising awareness about the necessity for multilateral cooperation on the matter. it is essential that the Alliance keeps underscoring the need for inclusion and for choices that leave no one behind. We should continuously see and project poverty alleviation as the first critical step towards promoting international peace and security and throwing in the rule of law and advancing the cause of human rights and good governance. Before concluding, I would like to underscore my great appreciation to the dedicated work of the team members who constituted a task force to get us not only to push this alliance, but also to get this alliance launched today. In particular, Professor Murtala Julia Balogun, who is advisor in my office. I also obviously would like, through you as well, all of you, to thank USG Melissa Fleming of the Department of Global Communications for her excellent stewardship of this launch. Obviously, one other group that is key behind the scenes is the technical team that has got us to get this from the DGACM to BCSS, all have been very key to the achievement of this particular launch. I would like to conclude by once again thanking Your Excellencies for your patience and attention. It's my honor again to join in this launch and to congratulate the interim coordinator, Ambassador Samson Togoje of the Mission of Nigeria to the United Nations, as he works to get the alliance off the ground with all the support that we have promised to provide. I thank you.
So they said the minister from Nicaragua couldn't speak.
Oh, let him speak now.
Except you say.
Yeah, now I understand that there's another minister from Nicaragua who has been unable to speak. If he's around, can he please speak?
So PJ is calling him.
Yeah, please, he can speak because, yes.
President, yeah.
Please let him speak. Let him speak.
Yeah, tell your minister to speak.
Honorable Minister from Nicaragua, please. It's very important because this is an alliance.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. This is Managua speaking. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. President and Madam Moderator. Markets concentrate wealth and distribution requires state action. Laissez-faire or neoliberal policy that a poor redistribution lead to concentration of wealth in the top 1% of the population. Every century, economists warn that overconcentration leads to crisis. But politicians and statesmen tend to take action after the crisis, not before. After the long depression that ended in 1890, concentration was addressed through anti-monopoly legislation. After the financial crisis of 1907, the progressive income tax was introduced. And in the midst of the Great Depression that began in 1929, Social Security insurance was organized. All of these measures represent significant redistribution. After the financial crisis 2007, 2009, and the Great Recession that followed, no redistribution was undertaken. Dodd-Frank and Basel III are worried about banks, not poor people. The Great Confinement, multi-trillion-dollar policy response to COVID-19 led to Jeff Bezos of Amazon's wealth increasing by $29 billion in 4 months. While in the same period, 47 million U.S. workers filed for unemployment insurance. Where will this process lead? Poverty and inequality, especially with artificial intelligence impending. The Great Depression 2020 will be the greatest poverty and inequality period of our lifetime. Serious redistributive measures are required. At the international level, 2 measures can be taken immediately. One would be to pressure coercive unilateral measure countries to immediately cease and desist from illegal action. They are self-appointed vigilantes that operate in violation of international law, deepening poverty, inequality, and pandemia, the latter constituting a crime against humanity, according to the official definition. The second measure is debt relief. It is better, far better, for everyone that debt be condoned all at once, avoiding a prolonged default by default public debt crisis on top of everything else. The example of Nicaragua is also didactic. We do not believe in one size fits all. Every country has to make its policies according to its reality, but some things might be of interest to others as well. When President Comandante Daniel Ortega took over the presidency in January 2007, Nicaraguan had a 48.3 poverty rate. By 2016, that had decreased to 24.9, and extreme poverty from 17.2 to 6.9. This occurred due to redistributive policy, capitalization of the poor, and investment in public goods, especially infrastructure, facilitating the inclusion of historically excluded groups. The first redistributive measure applied by the government was the restitution of the constitutional right to universal and free health and education, which were curtailed during the 16 prior years of this government. This represents a saving of $845 a year for a family of 5. Also, the subsidy on family transportation represents a saving of $580 a year for the same family. Capitalization of the poor includes the program Zero Hunger, that has made farmers of rural women, Zero Usury, which is microcredit at 5% per annum, and the demarcation and titling of more than 37,000 square kilometers of ancestral land for indigenous and Afro-descendant communities. I will finish with 2 examples and a conclusion, Mr. President. With regard to infrastructure, electricity coverage has increased from 54% of households in 2007 to 97% in 2020, a significant redistributive infrastructure plus for poor people. With regard to inclusion, the Davos Economic Forum had Nicaragua and 90th in the world in 2007 in the Gender Gap Index, while Nicaragua rose to 5th place in the world in 2019. The conclusion is that the Nicaraguan driving force includes social support, organization, and organizational capacity, 1 million plus volunteers annually, mostly women and youth, as well as firm political will to achieve poverty and inequality reduction. Thank you very much, Mr. President, and thank you especially for providing the opportunity to speak.
Thank you very much, Honourable Minister, and thank you very much, distinguished colleagues. The meeting is closed. Thank you very much indeed. We continue to hear from the interim coordinator, Ambassador Salman Toguji. Thank you very much.